Clock on the wall says it's 6 o'clock, so I will call the June 27, 2019 meeting of the Bastrop Planning and Zoning Commission to order. And Secretary, will you please call the roll?
Debbie Moore. Patrick Connell.
Here.
Cynthia Meyer.
Present.
Richard let us know that he would not be in attendance. Matt Lassen.
Here.
Cheryl Lee.
Present.
Greg let us know that he would not be in. Tom Dawson.
Present.
Pablo Serna.
Here.
Thank you, ma'am. We do have a quorum. Item 2 on the agenda is citizen comments. This is a time when anyone that wanting to address the commission on anything not on the agenda and have 3 minutes to speak. Are there any citizen comments?
Not at this time, Madam Chair.
Seeing none, we will move on to the next item. Item 3, items for individual consideration. Item 3A, consider an action to approve meeting minutes from the April 25, 2019 regular meeting and June 6, 2019 special meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. The minutes were sent to us for any corrections, additions, amendments. Are there any? If none, I will entertain a motion.
Motion to approve as is.
Second. For both meeting minutes,
Yeah,
right?
it's just one item, yes, I believe so.
Okay. Is there any objection? If none, both of them are approved and will sign before we leave. Item 3B, consider action to recommend approval of Shane Subdivision Short Form Final Plat with the variance to the subdivision ordinance requirement that the lot size comply with Chapter 14, Section 30.4A, requiring a minimum lot area of 1 acre, with the current lot being .273 acres out of Bastrop Town Tract A11, located at 304 Industrial Boulevard in the city limits of Bastrop, Texas. Ms. Bills.
Good evening. This is a final plat that's going through the short form process. So it's a plat that needs public review, but it doesn't need to do the full preliminary and final process. So in this case, they're creating a one-lot industrial subdivision. The need was created by that lots around them were either deed-divided or subdivided over the years, and this didn't meet our legal lot requirement, so it had to be platted. They're also requesting a subdivision variance because they don't meet the minimum lot size for an industrial lot per the code, which is 1 acre. So they're requesting that variance with this to plat it as it has been for the last probably 15 years or so. The location of this property is at 304 Industrial Boulevard. There's a couple structures. The main structure on the property actually burned down several years ago, so they need to demo and rebuild the site, prompting the need to come into compliance. The zoning for the surrounding area is all industrial park with some light industrial to the south and some other commercial and multifamily 2 zoning in that area. The future land use is it's actually industry we have for this area, so it's in compliance with the comprehensive plan. This actually came in prior to the end of the moratorium, so it did receive an exemption at the February 26th meeting. Staff has reviewed this plan, and all the requirements meet our Code of Ordinance Chapter 10 subdivisions, so it's been deemed administratively complete and ready for your review. Any questions?
And you sent out the notices to the neighbors and you received
Notices went out to, it's 200 feet around.
Are there any questions?
Yes, please.
Sure.
So I guess I was kind of looking into this, and there's some interest with the plotting process. It looked like from the county records that all the adjacent properties had been subdivided properly and platted because they're all part of a subdivision. But then this one was deed divided. I mean,
it was just basically a remainder lot. Everything around it got subdivided, and this one just got left out of any of those adjacent plats.
When did those subdivisions happen to you?
They happened over a series of time. So, but this one did not meet. I'd have to look up exactly. It did not meet our 1981 date.
Yeah, so it was deed divided after that. Off of, perhaps, I guess we don't know.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't necessarily deed divided. It was everything around it was platted, and it just didn't get platted. So, but that means that it still didn't go through a proper platting process to get to that shape.
Okay. I guess the other question is, so as far as the use of the short-term form plat, I was looking into, just administrative platting, which wouldn't require them to bring it to this board or to city council. Short form and then the long form. It still seemed like short form had a restriction on using it if you needed to apply for a variance, whereas the long form didn't have that. And I would assume that I guess I had a question as far as I'm all in favor of passing this and getting it done. I'm more just trying to figure out the process of, as I read in through the short form plat requirements, that you couldn't be asking for a variance at the same time, and I guess, is that the reason it became a short form rather than an administrative
Yes, that's
plat?
why it cannot be an administrative, is because of the variance. It has to have that public review element, which is why it comes to planning and
And I
zoning
know our
and city
code is a
council.
bit here and there. And
It's a little circular
like
in
it's
that
short form had
section,
okay.
so it kind of takes it in a circle. In the clearest way, there are no public improvements required by this, so the simplest way seemed to go through the short form, which only requires one process and one trip to P&Z and council with the variance.
Yeah, and so as you said, this already has all the improvements done to it. It already has utilities, drainage, everything else, and
Yes.
everything is complete, and it fulfills the requirements of the plating process.
Yes. If save for the subdivision variance, it would have been able to go through an administrative process.
Is this subject to our ministerial approval?
Yes.
That's what we're doing, and it's met all the requirements under the grant.
Yes, a save for the variance. So.
There are no more questions? Is there a motion?
I would like to make a motion that we approve the variance to the subdivision ordinance and allow a smaller lot, or whatever size this is, and we approve and send to council with our recommendation that it be passed.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimously passed. Thank you. Item 3B, consider action to recommend approval. Oops, I just did that one. Item 3C, discussion on the Bastrop Building Block B3 code, including but not limited to applications and checklists, development flow chart, and parking regulations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. This is a continuation of the discussions we've been having regarding the building Bastrop codes. This evening on your docket are the applications and checklists, our development flow chart, and then parking regulations. Mr. Lewis and his team are here to help us cover some of these topics tonight, so we'll kind of tag team these as we move through. But today we're going to start with the development flow, and with that I'll turn it over to Mr. Lewis.
Good evening, Commission. Matt Lewis with Simple City Design. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about more of the procedural provisions of the code and how it gets applied through the process. And while we don't have all of the answers for this yet, tonight we'd like to get the Commission's input on some of the intent language behind applications and checklists, or the philosophy, the ideas of what Bastrop would like its development process to function like. So when an applicant comes into the process, how would they like them to flow through the process? I mean, is it rigid review? Is it, through collaboration? Those types of intent statements will help us actually write these standards. The intent with the overall process is to create a streamlined process, and we would expect that to be an outcome so that there's consistency and predictability for each applicant that enters the process, that they know where they can go, where they can receive answers, and how their application or their development would flow through the actual procedures. And so tonight we're going to walk you through a development flow chart that we've started based on the draft of the code as it is today. So if you wanted to develop in Bastrop, the first thing you would do is research the property and to determine what character district you would be in and what place type. If the property is already entitled, meaning that the property has already received a zoning designation of a place type, then it would send you on a different path. So next, you would schedule a pre-application meeting, and they would conduct a on-site visit. And so we haven't determined, currently we're saying that all of the applications would require this, and maybe there's only certain size requirements that would trigger that threshold. So those are the types of details we're still fleshing through and we'd like input into as we progress through this effort. And Planning Commission's recommendation to the policymakers, the City Council, would be really helpful as we start to refine these flow charts and these diagrams as we go forward. The intent of the on-site site visit is to really understand the characteristics of the sites, the surrounding areas of the potential development that's going forward. Is there a large oak tree that's the center of the neighborhood on a 2,000-acre development that's up on top of a hill, and is that the place that we identify with the applicant as the centerpiece, or do they have another idea? Those kind of things would be fleshed out so you can start to understand where drainage occurs, where there may be existing fence rows that you would want to integrate into the street network where you already created a tree-lined street rather than tearing all the trees down to create a tree-lined street. by replanting trees, right? Those types of things should be resolved and have dialogue out in the field in order to prevent that from happening later, where the plans have been designed in an office where no one ever walked the site to fully understand what was going on in the site. This is a critical piece, and we've been introducing this concept early on in the development of the code through staff meetings and through the public process as well, and we feel it's imperative that the community and the city actually integrate that into the process. After that's resolved, then you would use the site characteristics, so the existing topography, existing conditions of what's going on in the natural and built environment. You would use your character district standards, the place type standards, to create a draft concept plan. And the concept plan would be triggered generally on infill or greenfield, but they would be scaled differently. So we'll get to that in just a second. But and then the concept plan would be cleared by staff for an official submittal. Essentially, if you think of a large development at this time, they're going to have a sketch showing some block patterns, some streets, and it's nothing more than a bubble diagram showing streets, blocks, those types of things, existing trees, feature that may actually lend itself to inform the development as it goes forward, but it would be really early in the process. So if you do have a new neighborhood plan, which would be and if it's over 3.5 acres, it would be new neighborhood. If it's under, it would be considered infill development. And so under 3.5 acres or 3.4 acres, I think is the code says, actually, it's a typo. It's 3.4 acres, I apologize, so we need to modify that. It would be administrative approval. And if it's 3.4 acres or greater, then it would go into a new neighborhood plan. And those would require Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council approval, because they would be required to allocate the place types. That would be the allocation of zoning at that time, and they would be bringing that for a public conversation. Oh, yes, sir. And the reason that 3.4 is the determining size for infill or greenfill is it's the size of one building block under your existing DNA. And so in the code, we carried that same pattern forward. So if it's less than 3.4 acres, you're not having to generally build new streets, new full infrastructure, those types of things. It may be on existing streets, or you're building the streets around that individual block, and it's not a full neighborhood plan. Furthermore, the place type distribution, if the place types are already allocated, then it would just be a administrative type of approval. If they did need place types to be assigned, even though it's less than 3.4 acres, it would trigger a conversation with the zoning change. And so that would come before the Plan Commission for a public hearing, just like any zoning change under today's regulations.
Just for all of us and everybody that's watching, define entitlements for everybody.
Yes, sir. Entitlements means that the land has the appropriate uses or city permits in order to be developed. So that would be the allocation of place types. Your entitlements it could go down to water, wastewater, all the way up to permitting. And so the entitlements is meaning the permits that you have necessary to do development. And so in this context, so let's say that you would go into a neighborhood plan, you would need to do your place type designations on the actual ground. You would do a pedestrian shed analysis. A pedestrian shed is about 80 acres, and it's a quarter of a mile walk, which is about 5 minutes. A 5-minute walk, which is about 1,350 feet, if you will. Your downtown...
Shed is like a new kind of term. Could you go into how
yes, ma'am.
That came about?
Yes, ma'am. And so pedestrian shed is similar to watershed. As water sheds off, it will transition to a certain point where it sheds to another watershed, for example. People are very similar. They'll walk about that distance, and then it means that they won't go any further. So it sheds off into where it will disseminate. Some people will go a little bit further, but generally that's a distance that people would walk to services. And so that's the terminology of a pedestrian shed analysis. And so what the application would do is essentially show that they have the place type distribution within the pedestrian shed analysis. Within the 80 acres or 160 acre site, they would have to demonstrate the allocation of place types per the code. And I'm going through this. This is a lot of new terminology and nomenclature, and so we really do want to walk the community, the commission, and the council through this in a holistic way, because it's different. And so if you have questions as we're going, please feel free to continue to ask them. That's great. The next thing that would occur is they would do a street network. So they'd establish their blocks. And so there's block perimeters based off place types that they would allocate. And so they would just do rough sketches showing how the land area would be divided with their street networks. They would select street types and block structures. And if you'll recall in the your pattern book, we actually provided a series of recommended blocks. They could also study the downtown blocks. And because there's no minimum lot dimensions, the block structure can vary greatly based off of market demands, based off of builder preference, based off of all of those factors, but they would still have to meet the block perimeters that we set forth, which emulate the patterns of the downtown. Next, they would be required to have a public frontage plan, and this is basically showing where your sidewalks go, your streetscaping, your landscaping, how the street trees would be, your street furniture, and those types of things. And then they would do a geographic sensitivity survey. This is a new term, but these types of elements are generally required in most cities when you start doing development. It's the analysis of floodplain, the topography, tree surveys, those types of things. And then they would be required to allocate the civic space and parkland. So they would just show on the map where they're proposing parkland and those types to make sure that they're meeting their allocated percentages for parkland dedication, those types of things. Yes, sir.
How does this, just to this point, how does it scale for, I mean, like even 3.4 acres is a pretty big chunk of land for,
Yes, sir.
say, any homeowner to take on. But as we've got a large number of unplatted properties downtown that will have to be replatted and kind of trigger this whole process to go through here. Like, as far as all these requirements that might be used in like a new neighborhood plan, if we're talking about the typical homeowner who's, on a third of an acre is having to replat, what kind of requirements are, and I know it varies, but what's the intent of the requirements that we placed on that homeowner, to kind of go through? What kind of surveys will they have to have done? What kind of information will they have in order to kind of proceed forward as they look to redevelop their land?
So in the draft code, that's a great question, by the way. We wrote an exemption that anything that was a lot of record would be entitled to be vested under the current rules, and so that would remain. And so what would trigger platting is infrastructure improvements, necessary right-of-way dedications, if they're on unplatted property that's not done by lot of record. But the platting procedures would be pretty similar. The majority of the platting procedures are following state law. Am I answering?
Yeah, well, no, kind of, I guess. Well, like, say the plat we just kind of approved and passed on to council now. Small lot, it's always kind of been in existence, it's been used, they're just looking to redevelop it to, correct this fire damage. I mean, okay, so
Sure.
they're doing the short-term firm plat now, but I haven't seen, a flood plan, I haven't seen a frontage plan, I haven't seen, any of this stuff that could potentially be, I guess, required at that point for anybody platting a piece of property, right?
I see what you're saying. Yes, sir. Not necessarily. So if they had entitlements, then they would not be required to do that. Their place type allocation had already occurred, and the lot, as long as they weren't seeking to do something that wasn't allowed by the place type, they would be allowed to come in and go through a typical process, not requiring all of these triggers. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, I think I'm looking at, I'm trying not to jump ahead, so I'm trying to, I'm seeing like 1, 2, 3, and so I think what the question might be is that if they have entitlements, all right, so we're at number 1 right here, so
Right.
if it's less than 3.4, it's an administrative approval.
Correct.
So is it administrative approval of a new neighborhood plan? Or what is, or
Yes.
what is, if I'm not changing anything, like
Yeah.
the one we just did, if I'm not changing anything, it still goes through the new neighborhood plan.
They would do an analysis, a site walk, and they would do these standards. They would, if it's a small site, then they probably would already have the street established. The frontage would have probably already be established. And so what the staff would do is they would go in and note. And so in the code, we intentionally wrote that new neighborhood plans could be created by the applicant or by the city staff. And the intent was so that the city staff could actually help with those types of scenarios. And so in the scenario you're putting forth, let's make an assumption that the place type's established, all the entitlements are in place, then the city staff would say the street type is this, the public frontage plan was this, and they could just fill out a little new neighborhood plan that meets the intent. And so it's not a overwhelming process. It's automatically approved, and it would be an administrative approval where they would not be coming even for a public conversation because the entitlements would all be done.
Is there a better name than new neighborhood plan?
Yes, sir.
When I
Yeah.
read the new neighborhood plan, and then
You
I'm
think
trying
grander
to think
scale.
of the scenario we were putting forward, I think of a new neighborhood plan.
Mm-hmm.
We're creating something. We're subdividing lots. We're doing all that kind of stuff. If
Yes,
we're
sir.
just taking a lot that's got a place type, it's got entitlements, and like the one we
Yeah.
just did earlier is kind of, is a good example.
Are you just talking about if you have a third of an acre or less lot and you just want to build a single-family home? Is that what you're asking?
Well, more just, yeah, kind of, but I'm more just thinking,
Yeah.
the way the current code is written, that in order to even get a permit from the city of Bastrop, you have to have a lot of record or
Right.
a legal lot. I mean, this legal, illegal's kind of
So
been
that
thrown
will
around.
continue.
And there's two ways of doing that, right? Having it platted or
Right.
that it existed prior to 1981,
Right.
March 3rd. And so if someone had it subdivided, say in, 1982, sure, there may have been a house on it for the last, 20, 30 years.
Right.
But if you go and say, hey, I want to, build a shed in my backyard, which requires, or put a shed there, which requires a permit, technically you have to, you
Plat.
can't get a permit unless you plat, or say you want to do an addition to the house. And I know we've talked all about these thresholds and stuff like that, but at one point, an existing piece of property that's not necessarily being developed fresh, it's being, kind of just spruced up, redeveloped, will have to plat. And it's more just kind of that idea. And along with that, I guess my question is, through this process, at this point, there's a lot of getting staff input, staff walking the site, staff looking at the site, and then, in the new neighborhood plan under 3.5 acres, it's administrative approval, which is basically staff approval.
Yes.
Correct? And so I guess my question there is, that's all good and dandy if we got a committed staff that has the vision and understands, the intent of the code. But, 15 years down the road where you may have a staff who may not like the code or may not do this, there's an incredible amount of variability that can exist in that scenario between now and 15 years down the road. And I guess if you've got someone who's trying to develop, right, and do something under the 3.5 acres, it's kind of just, if staff likes what you're doing, great, you're in great shape. If staff doesn't like what you're doing, what kind of recourse are we going to write into the code for this group or this individual to say, look,
Yeah.
And again, you bring up really great points. One thing that is great is the structure of the code, and the foundation of the code is that even the parameters are set clear, even though it's flexible. And so the public realm and the space that you're getting for the streets and the designations of the blocks will forever emulate the patterns that you got downtown. Even if we're like, oh, we did not foresee some negative product coming out of this. Let's say that that's the case. And staff is not in favor of what's being produced. There's an appeal process that is built into the code. So an appeal from the Development Review Committee, or which is called the DRC, would come to the Planning Commission. And there was a recommendation that would even allow for a Planning Commission appeal to the City Council. So a two-stage process of appeal for administrative approvals.
So this is all written in and pretty, I think of some other cases we've had where people have tried to redo property. There's been a little bit of disagreement with the development standards, and it took them, in one case I'm thinking of a year before it came before this board, and I think for most of that time they didn't even know it was an opportunity that they could have had to say, hey, look, let's just take this, butting of the heads, to P&Z and figure out what we can do. And so just that, people doing it, I guess that information is available, and I don't know if it was readily available in the old code, but that it's kind of up front and center, like what do we do about disputes between, just in the process, I guess.
Yes, sir. And last night we had a community and developer forum, and the Home Builders Association was present, and that was part of the conversation they asked us is about this appeal process, and we worked through it and read those sections to them as well. So we actually went through that exact scenario with the home builders last night and read through that element of the code. And so it would allow for a two-stage process for appeals on those. Furthermore, they had asked, and I thought it was a good idea, that it would be staff initiated rather than the applicant even having to request it unless the applicant did not want to request it. So instead of them even having to file an appeal, it would automatically be put on the agenda by the staff. And I was like, that's a great recommendation. We can build that into the process and the checklist. That's the type of input we really are looking to get back from the Planning Commission and from the public. That's helpful, and that's a great recommendation. Yeah, and so we're building that into the process. It's going to be automatically, if there is a recommendation for denial by the staff and they can't work it through the Development Review Committee with the applicant, the staff is automatically going to just put it on the agenda. So, yes, sir.
So a question, I know some places have like a development assistance center.
Yes, sir.
And I don't know what we have here in place, but if we could have examples or something, if you doing this and we could describe it, it's a remodel or you're under 3.4 acres and or you're trying to find, we can kind of give them to people who are doing a lot of, they're getting the process started, they haven't hired professionals and they need some direction. I know this is a great start with this flow chart, but there's some technical information on here that, I think some people, we could break that down. And I don't know if you can come up with a YouTube channel or something just to kind of help people get through the development process. Because I think it's a good one. I don't think it's, but I have a different background. And like you, I did talk to the HBA and I thought, well, I think we're making it really simple, actually. We're having a graphic land development code compared to people who have like just endless paragraphs. So I think we're doing a really good thing. I just think that still we need to have something better, maybe visual or something audio or scenarios maybe for people who want to develop.
Yes, sir. That is helpful. And one of the comments that Commissioner Connell brought up is potentially dividing this into two processes, new neighborhood plan and infill. And we actually started off with that process. That we had it originally formed under that, but we'll go back to that. I think that may provide additional clarity having that separated rather than calling it that as well.
And I'll wait for you to finish going through this, but I think I pay attention most of our meetings, and so this to me I'm confused, and it's laid out and it's nice, but I mean in my head I'm trying to think of scenarios. Okay, if this is, if I want to add a garage, or if I'm if I buy an empty lot and I want to put a house on it, or put a commercial structure, or I want to buy 100 acres inside city limits and do a whole development. Where do I flow through this? And right now the way I look at it is that, if I want to put a garage, on my property, then I have to meet with staff, and then I have to wait for staff to come out and look at where the garage is going, and then they say, okay, that's great. Then I get to put the plan together, and then I get to submit it, and then it goes through, it seems like a lot, which I know, Matt, we've kind of talked about before. The big guys, that's pretty easy, right? The big guys, they come in, they have the money and the time and the energy and the know-how to go through all this process. For somebody who's, just a single citizen or a family or something, want to do something, where do they fall in the process and making sure that they're not sitting here going, okay,
absolutely.
And I think that's Pablo's point as well is making it easy, for everybody to come in and look at it and go, oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, and then here's what I got to do.
Yes, sir. And when we entered in this, the first step of the process that we sought was to not trigger a process. And in your scenarios that you just brought up, what we're hopeful of is it will not trigger a process. It's going to meet all the minimum requirements that would be allowed by the code. They would need to submit a site, development plan. It's just a permit. And so essentially they wouldn't even trigger this. And so that's the good news, is that those types of processes would automatically be permitted.
So they would just walk in the number 3 then, basically.
They would walk in.
Site development, site prep.
They would walk in having gone through that, because what you're going to do or city council is going to do when they rezone everything, they're going to entitle everything. So if you have a single family house and you're single family zoning now and it becomes a P3, you're entitled, you have P3. So if you want to add a storage shed, you come in and you pull a building permit. You're not wanting to change anything. You're already entitled, so you're just pulling a permit. You still might have to do a grading plan or something for the permit process, but you're not changing anything that would trigger a new neighborhood plan.
So the only thing that would trigger this stuff would be changing the shape of a piece of land.
Well, no, that would be a plat if you're wanting to change a use. Right?
Right.
If you're trying to change an allocation of place type, so go to a P3 to a P4.
Okay,
and
so
that triggers a new neighborhood plan.
This is
more zoning. Yes.
Type stuff. Okay.
Yes.
And so there's a platting process that has nothing to do with any of this.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Platting will,
so
it's in a different spot.
Because when I read like the public realm and platting, that's where
Platting is covered in here, but it's like 3 pages. But something I wanted to point out to your point, Commissioner Lassen, is before you get into the meat and bones of this, it talks about the variances process at the very beginning of the code. It's actually on page 15. of like 137. So it's right up front, right up, at the beginning, as not to be tucked away
Well,
in some.
to be fair, I did read that, and it's there, but I guess just the different papers and different sections.
Sure,
putting it
absolutely.
Together in my head, but.
Sure. But yeah, to be clear, if you're just pulling a building permit, even a new home, right, that's not been built on, that's still an infill home downtown, if it's got P3, you're already entitled, you're already meet the intent of this code, and you just have to pull a building permit.
So just really quickly, just remind me then, because I realize, like you said, this is more about character and platting's a different thing, but under that scenario of pulling a permit to build a new shed or a new garage, if it's an illegal lot, subdivided by meets and bounds after 1981, it's not necessarily that simple, right?
No, you still would have to replat.
So I have to go through again.
Yeah, you would still have to go through the platting process. None of this would exempt you from that today, and none of it, you're not exempt under our current regulations, so that won't change.
Well, and so that's one of the things I think you were here for that, where we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, let's ignore what's there now, should there be a threshold where I want to build a garage, right, and it's a 20 by 15 foot garage. Should that homeowner be stuck, going through the platting process for that, if that's what they're wanting to build? And we spent a lot of time, and it was like, if you want to do an addition that's 10 by 10 or 100 square feet or less, we won't trigger the replat process. You want to go in and add more than 100 square feet to the house that's already there, that'll trigger the replat process. Yeah. And I think that the concern was always, do we put does somebody who's just barely qualifying for a loan to do an addition to their house need to be stuck with an extra $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 and an extra 1, 2, or 3 months, to do that? Or should there be a threshold where it says, look, if it's something smaller, we get it. We're not trying to burden you. We got to balance the idea that we want to have these legal lots. We want to make sure they're platted versus, over encumbering somebody that just wants to, build a garage or add a small addition, for mother-in-law or something like that. So,
generally speaking, it's a really good idea to have somebody plat, especially in older areas. There's an example we ran into recently where somebody was wanting to do something to their property. There were some overhead electric utilities that actually weren't on, that were on this person's property, but they served another property, but they took their service from the street. So the only way that the adjacent property owner had access was through this other person's property, who actually didn't need the lines. So it had just been there for so long that that's just the way it was. So by having somebody trigger that plat, you can actually get a dedicated easement for utilities, for infrastructure, for right-of-way dedication and things of that nature. I think historically how we've done it in Bastrop is the legal lot, which is 1981 and prior. That is not, you don't have to come into plat, it's just the legal lot, which this continues the code. But I'm not sure if that's something you all want to debate or not.
Well, we've had the debate a lot. I mean, we had talked about it, and again, I forget when. To Patrick's point, I think we had kind of come up with a percentage of square footage that didn't necessarily require a replat, or just a plat of the property. I guess it's, part of the idea is, we understand fiscally sustainable, geographically sensitive, and historically accurate, or, however, the way it's worded. But there's an affordability as well, that I think what makes Bastrop isn't necessarily the way the streets look, but it's also the cross-section of people that we have living downtown. And, and you force some of these new development standards on, lots, which I get it's maybe a good idea to replat, that at some point, that's a valuable itself, but it's not really valuable to the person living on it necessarily. It's, the city, it makes their books nice and tidy. But and that's kind of, I think, what we try to balance a lot is that, are we just going to kick out everyone that doesn't make under 6 figures out of our city and say, look, you just can't afford to live here because you can't afford to do this survey, that survey, replat this.
Yes,
and the other question, kind of akin to that, is when a homeowner does need a replat, what technically in the development process, there's, at least the way I understand it, you're putting in the improvements, you're putting in everything. If you're living on a street that's relatively unimproved and you go to replat, so now you're struggling to get a loan, you do have to replat. You dig up the $2,000 to get the surveyor out there, and, he
Sure.
digs this up for you. You've got the extra 3 or 4 months. But then the city says, well, you know what? You don't have sidewalks. The drainage pipe in front of your street has been leaking, and technically since you're replatting, you're developing this property, you need to bring all the infrastructure up to standard as well. Although it's already there, and so where does that kind of leave things?
Yes, sir. And you bring up very valid points, and the intent is never to stifle the ability for someone to progress, and so that's not the intent. Some of the questions you all are asking push state law boundaries. Under the state of Texas, if you're really not supposed to be building on unplatted lots under state law, so I would advise the legal department to weigh in on this conversation. One thing that we did do in the code following state laws, we did write platting exemptions that you can build accessory buildings, construction or repair of fence, remodel and repairs of existing structures, and those are exempt from platting requirements. So we wrote those in there. The state law gives us provisions to allow that already, and those have been built into the code already. So there's plat exemptions, and these are under, they're on page 21 under 2.2B4, and yeah. And so, so the platting exemptions are in there, and we followed the state law requirements on this. It's never the intent to create undue burden to anyone. However, with the city's, fiduciary requirements and consistency requirements, it must be fair in the way that it treats everyone. And so, when it gets in really sticky situations where you're allowing exemptions for someone to not build or not plat outside of the realm of the rules, and so,
to that point, I completely agree. It's got to be a fair process. Everybody needs to be treated equally, but not every development process is equal.
Right.
At the same time, some people are going to be developing property that has a street in front of their house. Other people are developing property that doesn't have a street. That
Yes,
they
sir.
do. So not every walking through the door is the same project.
Absolutely.
And I think different projects absolutely deserve different consideration. And that's kind of, sure, everybody's equal. Everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves to be treated honestly. Everyone deserves to be able to look at the code and say, hey, this applies to me.
Yes,
but
sir.
I think everyone understands, having done some development commercially and residentially, for my own home, I get there's a standard. I built a commercial building, and it's like, you got to do this. It's like, all right, this is just the stuff you got to do to get it done. I'm building something so I can step into this community and hopefully help it, but make money off of it as well.
Right, yeah.
I get there's a standard there that needs to be done, but at the same time, as someone who's trying to live in town and live on this piece of property, there needs to be a standard that needs to be upheld. I'm not saying we erode a standard necessarily, but there are different types of projects that need to be done as well.
Yes, sir.
And different types of development. And so, not everyone has to rebuild and has to build a road, but some will. But
Absolutely.
you wouldn't say they're being treated unequally.
Yes, sir. And then
Go ahead.
the intent of the entire code was to lower the barrier of entry so that people could achieve this. And so furthermore, we thought that it would be imperative for the site walk so that collaboration could start right at the beginning of the conversation for each of these different applications that come in, because each site is unique and every site varies. You may have 3-phase power across the street and 1 phase at the site. And so looking at those to figure out how the applications would be submitted and how the coordination would happen throughout the site starts at the first step of the process. And that's why we believe that is a really imperative part of having this happen. But really and truly, we've thought through this to create as many exemptions and reduce the barrier of entry to cut the upfront cost as much as possible without sacrificing the long-term goals of the community. And so that is the intent with the way that the structure of the code
I guess there's
happened.
one question, one more on this section, because in the end, I agree with what you're trying to do. I like where we're heading with all this, and I'm going to recommend it wholeheartedly in the end, no matter what we kind of come up with here. But when you were coming up with the ideas for this, I guess my concern from a homeowner standpoint is that these rules get written for commercial development, and that homeowners are left to find a way through it. And I guess, in your philosophy in writing this, what was your mindset in writing it? You may have had multiple mindsets, absolutely, but have you, that's the process, because, we're mostly a board of homeowners up here.
Yes, sir.
And that's the way we're going to see most things as homeowners. And so I get there's a part of commercial development that's beyond the scope of what we understand necessarily. And I trust in your expertise to make sure that's taken care of. But like Patrick said, I don't think that's a problem. They've got their teams and they can hack their way through the code as it is. But I guess when you were writing this or coming up with it, what was your mindset? Were you thinking about commercial development primarily, redeveloping new areas, and how much thought was given to the actual redevelopment of downtown, which a significant amount will have to be done since a lot of it's unplatted property and a lot of it was subdivided past 1981.
Before you answer that, I want to say one thing. I want to say that I think you misspoke, me knowing what you've said in the past. The idea that everybody's equal is not true. Everybody's not equal. If you are a homeowner trying to develop a garage, that's one thing. If you are coming in trying to build a new home, from ground up, that's another. If you're trying to build a single commercial building on a single commercial lot, that's another. If you're trying to come in and take 100 acres and turn it into a neighborhood, what we traditionally think of a subdivision, that's entirely something different. Those different ideas are not equal, and I think the idea is they should not be treated the same, and that we should have increasing regulation as we go, or standards as we go, to make sure that, if your goal is to come into Bastrop, make money and get out, okay, that's fine, we have these. If your goal is to build your homestead here, okay, that's fine, we got here. If you're a local business owner, so we have that standard, but that the burden is placed on those that are coming in, making money and leaving, versus those that are trying to live here and grow here and stuff like that. So I would argue that everybody's not equal. The process should be different for those.
That was hopefully, obviously maybe not, but that was my intent of.
And, go ahead, Matt.
All right, so I want to try to circle back and answer some questions. So your concerns about the platting being triggered for accessory structures, remodels, and things like that. So it's in the current or the proposed code that those things will be exempted. So does that answer that question? Yeah. Okay. All right. So to circle back on what triggers the improvements, like the sidewalks and street trees, in some cases, like the 50% value we use, so it might make sense to say if you're increasing, or the value of the, structure being, remodeled and or built exceeds 50% of the current value, then it triggers those things. If not, then it does not. I just want to get we have to have something, because in lieu of not having something, we just have chaos. And so that's a great point, and I think that's a great thing to have a serious conversation about and see if we can make some type of recommendation on that for the site improvements. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I know you have questions on it, but
maybe might just be the language being used. Maybe you have something called small lot or small project process, or maybe it's just the language. And if I help people, and a lot of times they go, well, it's actually right here, and so then you walk through and go, oh, okay. And
but you could have a really small lot and have in the proposed code, you could have a very small lot, but it's still completely undeveloped lot or commercial lot. So you can have a very small lot, maybe have a very small house on it, and that's all that's going on there. So you're adding 100% of value, although you might have a smaller lot. So without having minimum lot standards, right. I don't know if you should do it by lot. Is that rational?
One thing I would like to see, and I don't know how this fits into into what we're doing, but it would be great if inside the code we had one of the front sections are, I am a homeowner, I am a small commercial developer, whatever, and go to if that's the case, you go to page 1, and at the top it starts I'm a homeowner, and you start to go down this flow chart of is your lot this or is it that, and you move back and forth, and perhaps you get into a process where the question is your improvement more than 50% of the value, current value of your home, or do you think it is? And if it's yes, well then guess what? Then you move off that page and you move into another section where it's platting. But it's basically a roadmap, because we're trying to go from a lot of words and complicated paragraphs to more of like a diagram and pictures and flow charts, and I feel like that would help move people through that. As far as when do we trigger it, I think that there might be 2 or 3 different things that we could do, whether it's a cost or a size or or lot size, something there maybe doesn't need to be just one.
Yes, sir. And I think you all are making very fair assumptions, and I believe it. I failed to explain this chart holistically enough, maybe in the interim. This chart is an attempt to take the highest level elements of the code and work through. It is not a sequential flow chart. So you don't have to start at 1 generally. Depending on the state of the site that you're trying to develop would trigger where in the actual flow is. What this was an attempt to do is really walk through the commission through the entire code, starting at the highest level and going down to the site level. I should have explained that on the front end, not a sequential flow chart. This was just our way of capturing all of the elements and requirements of the code that would trigger a process mapped out. That's what this is. So, and so it does kind of function like a flow chart, but it's not a equitable flow chart in the sense that you would have to start at phase 1. So I should have prefaced that part of the conversation before we got started.
Makes way more sense.
Yes, sir. I got, yeah.
Also, Matt, something very simple, because I'm just looking at it from somebody that really, just the average person. Could we just have definitions of things too in there?
Yes, ma'am. That's great. Yes, ma'am. Thanks. Would you all like me to go on to the next section? Okay. All right. So next we go into the public realm and platting standards. The public realm is the spaces between the streets. So in communities you have public realm and private realm. The private side is what people own. The public realm is owned by the people. It's the streets and the spaces in between the buildings, those types of places. And so under this you'll have short form land divisions, which are administrative plats, and then you'd have major plats, which would trigger preliminary plats, engineering, showing where lines would occur and the actual construction of the facilities. Under the preliminary plat, under major land divisions, you would have public improvement construction plans. You all have these in your code now. They're not called this, but public improvement construction plans ensure that the specs of the public infrastructure that private developers are building meet your standards. And so what happens is you'll have a public improvement construction plan. We call them PICPs. And so PICPs is the acronym for it. And it's imperative that you get these done, because then your infrastructure that's getting built and handed over to the city to be maintained in perpetuity is meeting your standards. And so that's something that is important. You do that now, but it's not called that. Preliminary plats would require P&Z approval, public improvement construction plans. PICPs would be administrative approval. And then final plats would be Planning and Zoning Commission approval as well. Final plat is at the time that they have created a legal division of land that can be built on. And so that would be the flow chart for how major land divisions happens. Those are your big developments. And short form could be under 4 lots or less. They're administrative in nature. They could be replats, plat vacations, those types of things. If they're vacating public infrastructure, public right-of-ways, they would be required to come before public body. So just a heads up on those. Those would not be under these amending plats or administrative unless variances or vacations of right-of-way or easements, those types of things are being requested. So this is a pretty typical process. And in order to keep the code short, this section in your previous code, I believe your platting section was over 75 pages alone. We were able to narrow it to 2 pages in the new code by following state law procedures and capturing those exemption in. So we really cut this down and studied the state law procedures. And so really and truly, we've streamlined that quite a bit over what was previously requested. Oh, good. It's not going anywhere.
What is, as far as the state law, is there anything, I mean, it's state law, so we shouldn't have to write anything in there, but, you know, I think there's a right to a 30-day review on submitting of a plat.
So a new House bill passed, and
Okay.
I just learned about it, but yes, somewhat.
Yes, it's the same? Or
It's more stringent now. So essentially what happens is the city has 30 days, they have to issue comments in 15, and they would have the ability to get comments back and addressed within 15. If there's no action within a 30-day period, it is statutorily approved. And so it's a little bit more stringent than what was previously adopted under old state law.
So real quick, and maybe this is for
Yeah.
other Matt. in the past, when people have submitted plats, the city has at times asked them to sign a piece of paper waiving
30-day
their right
waiver.
to 30-day review, and
Yeah.
if not, it was automatically administratively rejected.
Right.
Therefore, they'd never even gotten to the 30-day process, which seems like a violation of state law. But what is the idea with that going forward, and what's written in to help protect people when they do submit a plat?
Yeah, that's no longer a valid operation, so there's no waiver to that any longer. And it doesn't just apply to plat, it's any plan. So site plan, construction plan, anything like that. Again, this just passed. It goes into effect September 1st. So we're still working with our development review committee, with our city attorney, making sure that when it does go in line, that our process reflects that. It's actually called the shot clock bill. And so your time actually stops, like when you turn it over back to the applicant, from our understanding. So you have that 15-day review period, but when you turn it back over, they can't just hold it for 16 days and voila. So that's our understanding of how it's written. Again, it's pretty new, so we're still researching the ins and outs, but whatever our new process looks like, and we're still working on that right now, will reflect that new piece of legislation.
I can't advance the slide. All right, there we go. And the final section is the creation of the private realm. This is where the private development takes place on private property. And so at this point, they would submit a site development plan. This would show their landscaping, their trees, where their buildings are going, in their parking locations, dumpster locations, or if it's residential, garage location, parking, all of those types of things. Site development plans would be administratively approved, and they would contain building frontage plans. The building frontage plan shows how the building is relating to the street, and all of those vary by place type. So if you're in a rural environment, it's not so formal, it's pushed back. The trees may meander down the street. You may have open swell, bar ditch type of street infrastructure, where if you're in a formal, Main Street environment, the buildings would be brought up to the street, and the frontage plan would be much more conducive to what you see downtown. And then there's a variety of cross sections in between that the development community or the building community or the applicant could submit. They would show their lot configuration plan. This would be your lot layouts and how you would be meeting the international code standards for building separations. So under the B3 code, we did not code setbacks. And so what we did is we referred back to the International Code Council, or the ICC codes, for building separations. Again, we tried to deregulate this by following health, safety, welfare, and really focusing on the parameters that are going to lead to long-term fiscal sustainability and geographically sensitive and authentic places. And so that's the intent with that. And again, if it's a commercial development, they would articulate their signage plan and their streetscaping. Your streetscaping is your street furniture, trash cans, and the idea is that different districts could have different specs for trash cans or street lightings. Maybe downtown gets black street lightings, the water district gets blue street lights. I'm just saying that those types of specs could vary by district if the community wanted to do that. And so as we're writing the development manual, those are the types of questions we'll be posing to the staff. Would you like consistency throughout the entire city for how the street lights, what fixtures types you use? Are there modern fixtures that get used in certain areas and historic fixtures that get used in other areas? Are the trash cans all unique? All of those kind of specifications are going to be written into the manual. Commissioner Lassen, you asked a question about how the philosophy or the intent went with the creation of the code, and it was very much to favor not triggering compliance. And in fact, the fact that we determined that 3.4 acres as infill is so much more substantial than any community that I'm aware of. Generally, if you have a lot that's over the minimum SF zoning requirement, then you're triggering all these criteria. What we try to do is really provide ample room for the community to have the ability to build without having to trigger a bunch of codes. Just really thinking about health, safety, welfare, but furthermore, making sure that the buildings have positive long-term effects on the community rather than, just short-term. So we really did think through that as we were going through this and tried to really deregulate where regulations were already in place. We deferred to them rather than rewriting new standards that would conflict with them, that creates, conflicts in the code. And so there's harmony in the code, and everything is deferred to standards that were already existing. So we tried to do that as much as possible so that did not occur to create additional burden. So with that, that was the flow chart, and we'll continue. Oh, yeah.
So, and you'll have to apologize or excuse us. This is like rough draft, but this is something that we took a look at as a staff, and it kind of identifies different like development intensity. Oh, y'all can't. There you go. There you go. Thank you, Colin. So it identifies different development intensity levels. So improvements to existing developments, additions, or accessory structures. Those are kind of like the first 3 levels. And it kind of tells you, like an addition, you'll have to do a stormwater grading plan. That's no different from today. If you're increasing the footprint, we want to make sure you're not doing anything to your neighbor, making additional runoff. And then the building type plan. Do you fit the building type under the P3 zoning? And so those first 3 levels, we kind of decided, okay, if you're under those first 3 levels, you're not really a developer. All right, those are your homestead occupied homeowners coming in wanting to make some improvements to your property, and then anything 4 and below. So any vacant or new lot build would then trigger like the right-of-way regulations, landscaping, things of that nature. So if you're developing on 1 to 2 or more vacant lots, then you're kind of doing something that outside of the scope of a normal homeowner, and then it just intensifies from there. So I think this is kind of what y'all were looking for, that would preface this chart and say, okay, here's kind of the different levels of intensity. If you're just doing an addition, you go to this step and kind of skip over the rest of those kind of plans, and that kind of points you to this process flow chart. Is that kind of what y'all were thinking about or looking for?
One just kind of additional question along this, and I don't know if we have this kind of detail yet, but you like say in level 3, which would be a, intense kind of homeowner, redone. When it comes to just kind of the documentation for the process, okay, this homeowner got an engineer or an architect involved and they did this. Is there a clear definition of why we need, for each page that, like, say, an architect would fill out, you're going to receive a bill for that, kind of, or it's an overall project. But, I've seen many cases where, you're remodeling an apartment in a giant high-rise, and the cities have required that the frontage be redrafted and everything else of the entire high-rise, because that's the frontage of the building, level A1, page A1 says, do this or that, or, whichever page it falls on, in the architectural plans. Just as far as common sense, as far as what plans are required, I guess, whether it's here or there, I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a good point. Like interior remodels, for example, we wouldn't require architectural elevations because it's not really relevant to the work you're doing. On an addition, we would want to see a lot of that stuff. We would want to see elevations because you got to look at building materials. You got to look at the footprint because you got to look at a grading plan, right? Because again, you don't want to shed water on your neighbor and cause some drainage problem that wasn't there today. So it does depend. But to that point, if it's an interior remodel, and you're coming in for a permit, we wouldn't ask you for an exterior elevation because it's not relevant to the job.
What I would agree, I've seen it where it has been enforced, and just making sure that, like,
Yeah, we don't do that today, and we
not
don't
necessarily here,
anticipate. Yeah,
but just the.
sure.
We're not triggering some process that says, well, it says right here in the
No.
International Building Code that you have to have this, and
No.
you're applying for a permit, and you're going to
No,
structurally
and I think
change
Matt did a good job. We're trying to deregulate. We're trying to streamline. And we're trying to take the common sense approach to this all. They've done a good job of making the codes talk to one another, and I think That's what's put us in a disadvantage in the past, is we have all these regulations that don't speak the same language. Well, now all of our codes will, and so it'll be very clear the process and where you are and where you start in that process. But to his point, not having to come before any board to do a zoning change, for example, on something 3.5 acres or less is pretty phenomenal. Typically, anytime you do something like that, it automatically triggers it. So we're trying to be more flexible, trying to remove the red tape. And like we've said before, as long as you do what you all say to do in the code as a P&Z, as a council, we think that's great. Come and do it. It's when you step outside of these bounds that you have to go through some type of regulation or come before a public board. So.
I have a question. So this may be another meeting, another time, but how is this going to be communicated to the public? What form are we going to be using to communicate this to the public? If I were to go online and pull this up and try to read it myself from home and understand it, is that flow chart going to be online somewhere?
Yes.
For me to be able to assess whether or not where I'm at in this process?
Absolutely. Great question. So today, the draft codes have been online. The process has still been kind of being vetted, and so this is kind of the first crack at it. Once we get it refined, it'll just go right into the process section of the codes, and so it'll all be one document. And then other things will be in the technical manual, but there's a process section within those codes that these kind of flow charts and things will live.
Might I suggest, and I don't know what our technical group is like that could set this up, but would it be possible to do a checklist online so that if I were building a shed on my property, there were a series of questions that I would click on to say, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, and then voila, here's what you need to do to complete your project.
That's a great point. So currently all of our checklists are online, but I think we're looking at some point in the future to do an update to our website. I don't know that it has that capability now, but as we look to update it in the future, we can certainly look at, you can always do a fillable PDF, but that's not what you're really talking about. You're
Right,
talking about more of
something
interactive.
This is what I'm doing, check, check, check. Okay,
Yep.
You need to go down to the city and replat.
We can look at doing that as we update the
So are you
website.
talking about a flow chart where I could figure out what I need to do before I go down to the city, or are you talking about something that's more like
Electronic.
I could submit all of my stuff from my living room, submit my packet. I don't even have to come down to the city. I can get updates on the status because the staff updates it as they go.
Something more electronic that gets me started.
Yeah.
Because I may not even know I need to come down. So kind of just a simple software that allows the user to check mark certain things that they might or might not be doing, and then that will then direct them as to what the next step would be for them. It may pop up and say, oh, you're free, well, you have free will to do whatever you want to do, don't worry about it. Or it may come up and say, please visit City Hall.
Yeah. We can explore that. I've seen examples where it's set up similar to like the flow chart, if you will, and it'll say, are you building a shed? And you click that, and then once you click that, it populates, you need to go see so-and-so at the front desk at the planning department. That's certainly doable as we add different features to the website moving forward. But I'd have to research as far as like interactive actual software that will virtually walk you through like an entire process.
Well, I don't think she's even talking about that.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just basically, how do we get started? And
Yeah, no,
and
that
you can
that we
always
can
get
do.
more sophisticated later, but just to help the general population to know how to get started.
So let me add on to Cheryl's point, and also Pablo brought this up. The reason this works so great for me is because there's so many pictures, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. So in addition to what Cheryl's saying, if we could get some pictures of this is great, this is not great, recommendations, things like that. I just really think it shows so much to a person than, instead of just reading all the language.
Okay.
I want to touch on something real quick earlier before we start talking about that. So it is in what we have now, it is possible to build a structure of some kind on an illegal lot without having to go through that process.
That's correct.
Okay.
An accessory structure, yes.
I'm thinking a small addition, accessory structure, a shed,
Yes.
There's provisions in here that allow that to happen, and an illegal lot will remain an illegal lot until some type of substantial change occurs.
Yes, so
Okay.
it's an accessory building, the construction or repair of a fence or remodeling or repair which involves no expansion or square footage.
So accessory structure, yes, but addition to a primary structure, that would trigger a replat process, or a platting process.
It could,
Could, if it's an illegal lot.
correct.
Okay, but building a
Unless
garage
it's a legal lot of record that was done prior to 1981. So if it was-
Is there a reason why I could build a garage with an apartment over it without having to replat, but adding a small 10 by 10 addition to the main structure would require that?
Yeah.
I don't know if, this is something I'd like to talk with your city attorney about to see if there's provisions that the community has the ability to supersede state law on this. Maybe you can add a threshold. I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to it, but I think that's a great question we can carry back to say maybe the community does have the ability to have a size or a percentage that would be allowable without triggering it.
We spent a lot of time, if I recall, a lot of time debating where that threshold might be, where, again, it's just making it easier on that homestead or that homeowner. Again,
Right.
my mother-in-law's moving in, unfortunately, so I got to put a 10 by 10 addition on, and, to make stuff happen. I'm just saying.
I think right now, is it 5%? We're allowed, under the current exemption, 5% of the site. You could.
I think currently, if it's an illegal lot, there's no.
Okay, I didn't.
No, there's no exemptions on expanding in the current code. The 5% goes into the drainage requirements. That's,
So currently, if it's an illegal lot, Pablo, you can't do anything without having it platted, right?
fences, or you can do fences.
You can put up a fence.
Yes, but expanding out the footprint of any buildings currently requires, but if you are a legal lot, which is 81 or before, which a lot of property downtown is still, I mean, I would say probably over half and half. I mean, 90% of downtown's unplatted, but still a lot of it is still technically a lot of record, so.
We spend so much time, I think, talking about that. I think it's important to not ignore that. So having the city attorney look at that to see if there is the ability to set some thresholds for maybe additions as well, since it sounds like accessory structures and fences are already good to go. If we could look at that for additions too, I think that would probably be ideal.
And as long as you're going to them, I mean, just as far as in the local government code, it's 212, section .002 just reads, after a public hearing on the matter, the governing body of the municipality may adopt rules governing plats and subdivisions and land. So the way I read the code, it seems like the city has quite a bit of leeway in state law to develop their own process for whatever it is. And so you could just kind of bring that up with the city attorney as well and find out what, I mean, it seems like at one point the city of Bastrop decided to make that 1981. They're like, you know what, we're going to do everything 1981, and that's their right under state law to make that decision.
That's the first time we had a subdivision ordinance of any kind. That's why it's.
Yeah. But the subdivision was brought, it was long before then. That's just when the city of Bastrop adopted it. Or
That's our
made
first
some official
codified
statement.
subdivision ordinance
Was 1981. Yeah, that's under state law.
Okay, so
So you-
1981 exists in every city.
No.
as far as-
It's
Just whether
whenever
you need
you
to replat or not.
whenever you
So it-
adopted your current regulations, anything prior to that per municipality, so it might be 1962 and another one, is whenever you formally adopted subdivision requirements, which in Bastrop was 81. The state gives you the authority to determine it a legal lot of record if it was done in an appropriate manner at the time prior to the adoption of your subdivision regulations.
April 4th?
Oh,
What
gosh.
is it?
April 20th.
Missed it by a couple of years. So before April 20th, that there was no, you could cut it up however you want, and you just file it at the county's office and you're good.
That's right.
After that, the city stepped in and said, hey, you got to go through some type of process so we know what you're doing. That's where the cutoff is.
Okay, so that 1981, that's given by right under state law?
That's correct. It
'Cause I know
gives,
at one point we talked about doing away with this and just requiring everyone to reply.
and you could do that, but the state code or state law gives cities the authority to make that determination whether or not you want to do that. You don't have to allow it, but it gives you the statutory authority to decide to do legal lots, and then it outlines how you do that, which is how City of Bastrop has decided to do it for however long. Well, we haven't been doing legal lots for 1981, but
I don't think anything after 81 was legal for a number of years, too. We're finding.
okay.
So the next topic that we were going to discuss was applications and checklists. And because we're still early on in the process of figuring out how this works, we don't have applications and checklists done yet. What we'll do is we're going to go through these codes, excuse me, and build the staff roles into the applications, in the actual process, and that will unfold the applications and checklists of the individual characteristics. For example, one of the most successful ways of streamlining a process is really establishing who does what on what part of the project, who they're receiving it from, and who they're handing it off to. It helps take ownership of the project. It helps everyone understand where their wheelhouse is, and they can really become more refined in their roles to administer their process so that you can start to get more consistency. And so the thought is that we're going to go through that process to inform these outcomes of the application and checklist. What we would love to discuss with the commission tonight is the intent for the applications or thoughts that you all may have for the applications and checklists. This is a very dry topic, so I can't get too philosophical on it, but at the same time, it does state something when when the community says we want predictability, we want ease of use, we want user friendliness. Those kinds of things are what we're looking for and we would anticipate. But at this time, we don't have these drafted at this point. But we would like to talk to you all about either the philosophy of how you would like to see this flow, and then outcomes of what you'd like to see with the checklist, and what should be housed on it, those types of things. And so that's where we're at with this topic. So it's very early.
Well, I think Commissioner Lee hit the nail on the head there. A checklist, you check this off, you check this off. If this applies, then you go here. Mm-hmm. Ease of use would have to be top of my list, and I'm thinking more for the individual homeowner rather than the big developer that's coming in who's going to have a staff and their all their expertise. Something that can apply and be user-friendly as far as smaller infill and in single homeowners that want to do something on their lot.
So just to back that up, I think the word simplicity in that process.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I would say, I guess it's kind of, I've talked to a number of people that develop, in different places, and I guess more as a philosophy rather than it's, just kind of an attitude, I guess. But yeah. A number of people have said that at times they feel that their little project of adding on a shed or whatever, they feel like they're almost the enemy of the city. Like it's, I think most homeowners go into a process wanting to partner with the city because they don't know what to do, but instead they feel like the city's whipping boy in a certain sense. I know there's a certain regulation that has to be done, but as a city, we're here to help people develop. Like you said, we're trying to reduce the barriers to get in. We're trying to, I think people want to find, when they come in with a project, they want to find some kind of excitement or joy that, it's great we're getting this done. Let's see what we got to do to make sure this is done right, rather than, here's a stack of papers, these is your checklist, go get that done and come back later and, we'll review it. And it's a fine line, I guess, and it's, and again, it can happen in a lot of places. And a lot of times depends on who you talk to, but just an overall philosophy that, and you've said it here, and I think there's a lot of excitement about this code because I think people have been felt a little beat down or kicked around at times, you know, just trying to get through the project. Again, I'm talking about the homeowners here, you know, and so and I don't really know there's anything we can code in, you know, other than maybe a mission statement as far as, you know, okay, so this is what the code's trying to do, but, you know, what does the planning staff look at on the wall when it says, okay, I'm talking to a new homeowner, what words am I supposed to use? What attitude am I supposed to have, you know? And you know, Commissioner Lee, I think, has a great idea. It seems a little advanced for maybe where we are, but, you know, a dynamic checklist that sure you go on and you look at and it's like, hey, you know what? Yeah, I am going to pull new wire. I am going to put new plumbing in the walls. And so this changes the way your project needs to be, you know, be done. But, you know, you're like, no, I'm just changing fixtures or I'm just doing this. Like, well, you don't need a permit. You just call an electrician. He changes the electro fixture, you know. You know, but making it so people, you know, want to come and use the city's help, because I think people want to do it right. And if we make it too hard for them, if they feel like it's too burdensome, that sure, they're going to look for ways to subvert it. You know, and then we just lose the whole intent of the code. So I guess my mindset's, my thoughts have crystallized a little bit in my rambling, but I would say a nice mission statement that, you know, it's, you know, that, you know, is agreed upon, and it's what, you know, people read and when they deal with the citizens at large about how to help them with their project, rather than regulate their project.
I never would think that our staff was putting encumbrances in people's way, but we've had codes that were conflicting and they had to try to interpret. So this is going to be a great step forward, and it will enable the staff to more quickly get to yes, homeowner, you can do this. Yes, you may not be able to do it this way, but we can help you if you want to do it this way. And at the end of the day, I've had a good day when I've been able to help somebody get to yes.
I like that.
And I think, you know, that kind of attitude. And I think will make our staff smile a lot more, that they have simplicity in what they're interpreting for the people of Bastrop.
Matt, just some clarity real quick before I give my 2 cents. When we talk about applications and checklists, are we talking about what it is they need as a part of the application process?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And
so all great ideas, but I feel like what we're talking about here is how do we get the person from start, you know, to where they need to choose which application and which checklist. So the flow charts I think are a great idea in relation specifically to the applications and checklists. Checklists are great. We currently have them on our site now for, like, you know, if you're doing a plat or you're doing a survey, it's great. I can go through and check off that, yes, I have this, yes, I have that. One thing that would be nice for those is to have citations, because there are some things that don't apply, or you look at it and you go, okay, I see what the checklist item is, but I'm still slightly unclear. So if we had citations for each, and I'm not talking about like your name.
Code citation.
We don't need citation for that. But if it's, if somebody's doing a pedestrian shed analysis, if we have a link inside of that PDF, where they could go, or we have a citation in the code where they could go to clarify what does that mean. So the checklist that we have now that are the base that I'm assuming you guys will work off of are great. I like them a lot. The only thing that I notice when I use them or when I look at them is I miss citations, and I have to go searching, and I'm not really sure where to start. So
that's a great idea.
That would be useful. The applications and the checklist, I feel like, should be together in a single packet. So instead of me having to go to the site and choosing the right application and the right packet, if we could just have one link, and inside that link is the right checklist and the right application. Even if the same application can be used for 4 different checklists, if they're all attached, it keeps people from having to go from, okay, here's the application I need, and then go find then go find the checklist I need. So I think just putting it together so it's just one whole packet, instead of saying, okay, you need this application or this application, and then you need one of these 4 or 5 checklists, and then you might need this or that. And I understand that some of those have to be separated, like an agency, authorization, for example. You can't make that a part of every packet because it just doesn't make sense. So I understand those things when apply. As far as the applications go, ensuring that we don't have redundant information throughout the packet would be great. Now that could either be accomplished through an autofill PDF, or if I fill it in one spot, it'll autofill into a couple other spots where it's maybe prudent to have, but where I'm not having to go through and type in the same information 4 or 5 times inside the same application or packet or everything, which again lends itself to having a checklist and all required forms in one file, one PDF file, because then I'm not having to type the same stuff over and over 4 different times. I can just do it once and it autofills into those other parts of that document or that PDF. And then invest in looking into electronic submissions of applications. Not necessarily like we need a digital copy of the submission, but more or less like, again, I could sit at home in my underwear and submit my application for a certain project, at least to get it going. So something to that idea, because I think that would probably be fairly simple to set up as far as, you know, a submission process for that.
Yeah, all great ideas. That's awesome.
One more, is there going to be a way to, and I think right now you can click on GIS and you can get a summary more or less of that address?
Yes, sir. Like a zoning profile?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are we going to update that with all this new information
Yes.
so that it can kick out a easy to print out report? Maybe that can be part of the application process.
That's great. Zoning profile. Thank you all. Thanks. All right. Next order of business tonight is parking. So if y'all remember, I did a brief presentation on parking a couple months ago for you all. So now we're going to kind of start talking about how those different standards might integrate into the different place types. So we're going to start with the end in mind, obviously. We saw the model where it's current regulations aren't really fiscally sustainable, certainly don't lend themselves to geographically sensitive outcomes, and we can't continue to do Bastrop ways because that just gets us excess parking and bad environmental impacts. So taking a walk through the place types, instead of having, a use chart that says, if you're an office, you're going to have 1 per 200, or if you're a single family residential, you should have 2 on-street and 2 off-street parking requirements. We're going to take a look at doing things a little bit differently. So in the nature district, the P1 place type, we've thought about just using impervious cover, like total site. Impervious cover. So if you have a building footprint, right, then your parking would be restricted on how much impervious cover you have. So you couldn't go over an X amount of impervious cover for the entire site. And those things we still need to fine tune as we work through it, but that's kind of the thought. Clearly on all of this, we're gonna probably suggest that we have maximums. So for example, if you have a very large lot, we still probably don't want you to fill the whole thing up with parking. So we're going to look at what makes sense for each place type, and then work through that. And then as you'll see the place type or the characteristics in the code, those will be tied into the table for the different place types. But really nature impervious cover is a big thing for us. In the rural district, you'll probably still have an impervious cover limitation, but this is also where you might see some clustered development, and so you might see, like a shared parking, right? So if you had a neighborhood development, let's say, and they were kind of clustered and had shared spaces and things of that nature, well, maybe you wouldn't require each dwelling unit to have a parking space, but rather they have like a communal spot that everybody parks and then, walks to their house, so like a shared parking. And so that's kind of what you'd see, or what we would propose in the rural area. Neighborhood.
Quick question.
Yes.
So when we think of rural, we're thinking like more spread out, right?
Yes, unless it's clustered. So in that circumstance, you would have a more concentrated development in one area, but then it would be conservation around it.
So would you classify like the colony as something like this?
No, I would not.
Well, okay, that would be more P3.
That's P3.
Okay, so we're talking about, and the idea is in my head is that when you move into like that P2, you're looking to be away from people for the most part.
Yeah.
And
so cluster would be you share a common drive access to get to a common parking lot, and then you share, similar like a courtyard development, a traditional courtyard, you all share these spaces, like you share a front yard and you share these things, and you would just have a parking lot that services that little pod of development, if you will.
And would using this restrict individual parking, or this is just?
No.
No, okay. This is
No,
just-
but you might see some of these types of parkings introduced in these areas.
Okay.
And also, but it'd still be like an impervious cover. So if I'm a rural lot, I live on a few acres, you can still have parking for your house if you choose to do so, but we're going to actually, impose an impervious cover limit so you don't negatively impact anybody. So what we don't want you to do is cover your whole lot and or do something like that.
I'm just making sure I understand.
We just
it.
don't
We're
want you to
not
be
taking rural
overparked.
areas that are spread out and, walk half a mile to your house.
No, absolutely not. We're not doing away with the automobile. We're not doing away with parking. We're just trying to kind of get a little bit better handle on it and what makes sense for us.
Makes sense.
So really quickly, I just kind of see this in rural areas related to parking, but since we're doing away with minimum street frontages, and you see a lot of flag lots kind of in these type of areas, is there any specific regulation against flag lots? I know in the past city has had it.
We do flag lots. We won't do flag lots. Yeah. So, well,
You could do it, but it just wouldn't make any sense.
it doesn't really make sense. The way the block, to Mr. Lewis's point, the way the blocks are laid out and the block structure and the way the different building types have to interact with the block structure, you're really not going to see flag lots because it's
I'm just thinking a
impractical.
lot of just like north of town, there's a lot of areas that are pretty much developed the circumference of our 3.4 acres, but are left with the giant, 1.5 acre kind of central area that seems to be very difficult to develop, or it's unless you kind of create some type of small access to a road to get back there just with a driveway. No one's going to put a house back there if they haven't put a full road back there, but a driveway.
Oh, you're talking about driveway stand. So,
Well, and it kind
yeah.
of related to parking as well, but it's
Yeah.
more just what triggered the idea was.
So also in these kind of rural and natural environments, we're talking about not even requiring pavement. What types of surfaces can you use that will still allow emergency access, but not necessarily require somebody to put down, a concrete driveway. Again, trying to reduce costs, trying to reduce entry, maybe into home ownership or other things. So really, does it make sense? Do you have to have a concrete driveway? Sometimes no, sometimes yes. But again, that's going to be dictated by the place type. So if you're in, your P5 core, yeah, you're probably going to want to have, concrete or asphalt or something like that, because it's higher traffic, it's higher use, it's not going to stand the test of time, if you allow them to do something different. So again, it'll vary, but we're opening the door to that, whereas today you can't.
I think the restriction of impervious is critical, especially with the drainage issues that we have. Will there be encouragement of permeable material?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Again, where that makes sense. You can't do it everywhere, but where it makes sense, absolutely.
Are we incentivizing that or just allowing it?
Well, I think by allowing it, no, we're not incentivizing it. There wouldn't be like an enhanced, there wouldn't be a different review or anything, but by allowing it, again, we're trying to reduce costs, reduce everything like that. So by simply allowing it, I think it's more beneficial, where today we would just say, no, it's not allowed. Neighborhoods, so this would be really traditional, like the Colony, Pecan Park, Hunter's Crossing, Riverside Grove, anything. This is your P3, this is your neighborhoods downtown, so this is your more traditional neighborhood development pattern. So again, you'll see the impervious cover because we still, again, think that's very important given the history of flooding in the town. And we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our neighbors. We took a look at this, and maybe it's market driven. With the way things are going, there was a study done that like 70% of millennials want to live in a place where they don't even need to own a car. So if that's the case, and you want to build a development that there's a market for, where people don't have to own a car, because every parking spot you put in adds cost to development. So by requiring those parkings, you're actually increasing the cost of development. And if somebody did not want to do that, and they thought that there was a market and people were going to buy that, why would we require them to put that in? So market-driven is an option. Again, this is an area where we probably want to have maximums, just to the fact that you don't, pave your entire front driveway or things like that. And you might also see like some shared in this area. So, well, that's probably more in your P4. But really, impervious cover and maximums, and then we thought about even just market-driven would really be not having minimums, and that's something I think we need to keep in mind as we move to the future. Is with rideshare, with autonomous vehicles, although it doesn't get away from the automobile, some people just flat out don't want to own a car, and we want to be a place where that's okay. And we want to also be a place where if you want a car, that's fine too. We have a spot for you. So that's just kind of our thought on that. Any input on that one?
If I wanted to convert my garage, there's not going to be any kind of minimum, like you said, just maximums, correct?
Yeah, so that would drive into that market-driven and impervious cover. Now, if you have 5 cars and you enclose your driveway, and then you want to put in a 6-lane parking spot in your front yard, we're probably going to say, you're triggering our impervious cover. So again, it's not saying you cannot do that, but you cannot do that and also pave your entire front yard for a parking lot, because that goes against the walkability, it goes against the public realm interface. So those are the types of things. So if a homeowner decided to do that, and that fit their needs at that time, if you wanted to come in, you could then reconvert that space, but we wouldn't allow you to pave your entire front yard to park vehicles.
Are there going to be credits as well, or reductions factored in for bikes or charging stations or compact spaces?
We haven't looked at doing anything like that. We're still kind of unsure, and the data is kind of unsure on what that needs to look like. So we've been hesitant to write any of that things hard-coded into there, because, the whole electric vehicle, in terms of, how long they've been around is brand new. So we're not sure what that needs to look like. So we didn't want to hard code in anything that we're not real sure about. But we don't have any incentives right now for a developer to put in, compact spaces and or, charging stations. That would be, kind of a market-driven thing, and let them decide what's right for their development, so long as they meet, some of our parking regulations in that P5. But we don't have any incentive for a single-family resident to put in a charging station.
Curiosity, I like the maximums, but talking about minimums, which I know we're trying to get rid of, I just kind of feel that, there could be a scenario where, sure, there's an incentive to not develop driveways or put parking spots in because, hey, there's parking on the road, and then that just kind of creates another problem. And so, other than just kind of understanding there could be an issue there, I guess, what's kind of the thought regarding something of that nature?
I don't think I grasp your question.
Well, you spoke about, market-driven development,
Sure, yeah.
where you got a bunch of millennials that don't want to own cars, and so
Yeah.
I'm going to put, 50 units close to downtown where no cars are allowed. I allow for no parking, and so these millennials can walk downtown, do what they need to do, work downtown. They all work
Sure.
from their house anyway on computers, but yet, say half of them do own cars, but they still want to live in this community. It ends up parking on the street, which you can do, but I don't know if there's a up or down to it, which way you kind of figure it. I like the idea of maximums, but, I guess there are issues with the minimums, and is there any, anyway,
So
I would
again-
rather not have minimums than create minimums.
Yeah,
and have
so this
be a
would be kind
problem,
of your
but-
traditional, not your unit, multi-story complex. So this, again, we're talking about the park area, so not your traditional like high-rise, or not even high-rise, but your multifamily apartment or complex. We can get into that if you'd want to, a little bit further.
Well, yeah, I guess as you're saying is, if they did decide to park on the street with cars, it's in a more dispersed area usually,
Right.
that there may be parking on the street for that, rather than a high-rise where you have so many people in proximity and
There
just
wouldn't be a
assuming none of them are going to
situation
bring
where
cars.
that would take place, though, right? Yeah.
In this section, you wouldn't have that type of intensity. The building forms wouldn't allow for it. So one of the major enforcers of intensity in your code are the building types. And so the building types allowed under this are only houses and duplexes. And so you wouldn't have anything over house form in this that would generate that. But if you go up to the next zoning classification, even then, you're still capped at 3 stories, I believe, in all of the districts. You still hopefully wouldn't generate something of that magnitude. One thing I have seen done is if they don't have parking requirements, they'll do shared cars for those, and they'll have 2 shared cars out front that the community members can use. Again, it's not regulated, but it was, the market forces. Furthermore, in projects at that scale in the current lending institutions, they're going to require parking. So being market-driven, the lending institutions, the banks, when they see that unit count, generally the banks are saying, if you're not parking this, we're not providing you money. And so there's other checks and balances throughout the financial systems that are keeping this in check as well. But we're in a really interesting time period to say, building parking garages when autonomous vehicles are 5-10 years away. What happens with those types of structures, that infrastructure that's getting built now, where the level of parking, based on Austin's parking requirements, you have to have 5 stories of parking to build 4 stories of units, right? It's all out of whack. And so what I believe the staff is really trying to recommend is let's get this back in check, let the market determine it, the financial institutions, the developers, to kind of get this back in balance, and maybe they do underpark a few units and then you make adjustments. Hopefully that's not the case because it can add detriment, but I think we're in a learning position with regards to parking. We just returned from a conference. There's a UCLA professor that is the king of parking, and this is all he does is parking. Donald Shoup is his name, and he wrote the book of The High Cost of Free Parking. And he goes into it from the public realm and the private realm. It's a really fascinating deal, but parking is a sensitive deal, and right now all of the parking requirements are determining development outputs under your existing developments as well as developments outside of this area in this region. So I think this is an innovative approach, and hopefully there's a series of checks and balances that help keep it in check. But I think you all bring up really valid points.
Something that's not really considered quite often is public transit, because there's people like me that are getting older and we may not be able to drive. And if I park my car and I can catch a bus or a van, I don't need a car. I don't need to park anywhere.
Maybe you don't need a car, and that would lower your cost of living and will allow you to stay, age in place, I think is the term people use, that doesn't force you out for those types of reasons.
And I don't know if we've thought about this, but in some areas being able to have pull-offs for where a van or a bus can have people get off
Oh, yes, ma'am.
the vehicle without blocking the street, blocking a lane of the street.
Right.
A lane of the street.
Yeah. So those are all kind of figured into like our street sections and making sure that there's adequate. That's where I said there might not be noticeable difference between everything, but every space is used for a purpose. And certainly we've taken that in consideration because we want to be a multimodal transportation community. And certainly that public transit is a part of that. So
That was my life at one time.
So again, this is not really dealing with that intensity yet. But to that point, and he brings up a great point with financing and some things. You're not going to probably get away with nothing. But we just don't want you to be able to continue doing it as we have, because it really does impact the land use and the geography. So P4, the mix, if you will. So this is kind of your fringe of the downtown area. And you might have start to see like a shared parking, like I was talking about. So there might be instances where you have 2 homes that back up and share like a common parking space. That's tucked back behind the different building frontages. You might see commercial areas that do the same thing, where they don't have their own individual parking lot, but they share that. You might see the start of like a parking district, where the city comes in and builds some type of public infrastructure in this type of area, where that makes sense. Again, we would also have the maximums here, impervious cover. All those aren't on there, but you still have that limit. And of course, we wouldn't really have minimums. I think where the intensity, where the opportunity for multifamily goes up, based on the place type and or character district, we start introducing those minimums. And kind of the standard minimal approach is about 0.75 parking spaces per unit. So it's not even a full parking space per dwelling unit. So you might have, you can do the math on it, but whereas sometimes in today's codes you have two parking spaces per unit, which just, like Matt said, it lends itself to having more parking than you have units, and it's just nonsense, and it leads to empty parking lots with big drainage detention ponds that sit empty and just chew up your land. And so it's really not the most valuable use of property. So when we look at starting introducing those more intensive uses, we'll start kind of thinking about those minimums. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Okay. P5, so this is your downtown area. This is your heavier intensive commercial, retail. This is kind of the hotbed of the city. So when looking at some of the literature out there, and Mr. Shoup hasn't written one book, he's written several, and I've read a few of those lately. But paid parking, this is where we'd like to start having a conversation about introducing some of that in certain areas, and or creating lots. There was a study done a couple years ago, and in the downtown area, throughout different peak times, there's actually a 50% vacancy rate in your parking lots in downtown Bastrop today. So people although it might not be right in front of the storefront you want, there's available parking. You might just have to walk half a block to get to it. So we thought about looking at making those public utilities, like the city would manage it as an infrastructure project, similar to what we do today, but you might introduce a paid element to that. So people pay for what is valuable to them. So right now, if I wanted to, I could park my vehicle downtown, leave it there all day, could walk down here to work, and that would chew up a parking spot for a patron that wanted to use a restaurant on Main Street, for example. So there's no incentive for me to move. You could park it there as long as it's not doesn't become a junk or abandoned vehicle for an indefinite period of time. So there's no incentive for the curb turn to turn over down there. And also, when you do that, you create the ability to create parking districts. And these have actually been wildly successful. I think in the presentation I gave you, I talked about the one in a suburb in California where there were two neighborhoods, very similar demographic, very similar everything. One had a parking district, one did not. And the one that had a parking district was able to take those revenues generated from parking fees and reinvest them back into that geographic district. And street trees and benches and lighting and store facade grants that really brought some value to that. And it went from one of the lowest income and revenue producing sites in the city to the number one in a matter of about 10 years. So it literally quadrupled the amount of sales tax. It went from about $250,000 a year to upwards of $3 million in just a matter of 10 or 15 years. So this is where we'd like to start having a conversation about planning for the future to possibly introduce some of these things in these areas.
Do we have an estimate of what type of revenue would be generated if we currently had paid parking where we have parking downtown?
No, because we haven't got that far. This is a big policy decision, and it's something that would take a lot of time to study, to implement. What's the right way? Is it a mobile app? Is it metered? So how do you go about doing that? There's several ways to do it. But before we took the staff time and allocated our resources to go down that path, we need to have a policy conversation about it.
My biggest concern would be, I would assume you'd have to have at least 1.5 to 2 full-time employees to enforce paid parking.
No.
And so the question would be whether or not we could generate enough revenue to have somebody doing that, because I don't want our police officers checking on whether somebody's paid,
right,
or code enforcement because they're already stretched thin. So you'd have to hire somebody, because if there's nobody to enforce it, then I'll just sit here. I'll sit here for the next 3 days.
Yeah.
And nobody's gonna write me a ticket or do anything with it.
Yes.
So I think the question would be is, in future developments where we start to develop, these areas, it might make sense. I think about the parking we have downtown, our lot on the south side and then on the north side of Chestnut. If that was paid parking, if the spots on Main Street were paid parking, would we be able to generate enough revenue? You know, we're already talking about at peak times, we have 50% vacancy. You know, so if we turn those into paid spots, will we have enough revenue where we're breaking even, or maybe the city's making just a little bit of money, you know, versus, you know, is there a huge benefit to it?
Sure.
And so my opinion, with no data, whatever, looking at what we have, would be that we wouldn't be able to generate enough revenue to cover enforcement of paid parking.
Yeah, and I get that, but I think the conversation we need to have is the community willing to entertain that at all?
Matt, one thing that I'm concerned about on paid parking, especially metered parking downtown, is the leakage, which is just a euphemism for how many people are going to go somewhere else. And usually there's a 20% leakage rate when you put in paid parking. Therefore, you've got a lack of sales tax in the businesses that are down there. So implementing that and the cost seems like it would be almost prohibitive to do that. Plus, I know it generates revenue, but what message do we want to send people when they come downtown? Do we want to say, you're paying our sales tax, by the way, you're going to have to park down here, and the businesses that are down there are going to take, you know, the hit. So I think this is a real critical issue, especially for the downtown Main Street area. We don't, you know, we have lots, so are we going to have extra parking lots for people to have other options if we did something like that? It's just, I've been on Main Street for over 35 years, and I've seen it when we mark tires for 2-hour parking, and it does become an issue because then you have to have an officer that comes and checks the tires in line, and it just, that's one of my big things is the paid parking.
Sure.
I'm in agreement with, well, I have a couple of things. So I'm definitely in agreement with Patrick on the fact that you did say that we have 50% vacancy. So I don't think there's a problem with someone parking their car right now and hanging out all day because we have 50% vacancy, if I'm understanding that correctly. So why the need for paid parking? Because we're not at 100% of use right now. My other thing, to Cynthia's point, is, well, I mean, if you go back to talking about authentic Bastrop, that's not authentic Bastrop to have to now charge the community to park downtown. Even when we've had big events, I've never had a problem finding, I'm talking like homecoming parade, the Christmas events, anything downtown at the park. I don't see that it's ever been an issue to where we're not in Houston and we need available space. We're talking Bastrop. So what has this thing compared to? Have we gone to downtown Pflugerville and they have paid parking? Have we gone to downtown Round Rock and there's paid parking? What exactly is making this now an issue? And then the last question I had was you say areas. Certain areas. What areas are you referring to? Just the downtown area? So I think all of those things would need to be considered, but if we're at 50% vacancy, I don't see why we would cause, like to Cynthia's point again, people to not even want to park downtown or visit restaurants downtown because I don't want to have to pay for parking, or I don't want to have to leave my table and my meal to run outside to go pay for my parking like I have to do in Austin right now, which is unpleasant. So I don't see the thought process behind it based on our history here in Bastrop.
Okay.
I'm going to disagree with one of your points that I don't think the conversation doesn't start with whether the community will accept it or not, because the community could be all behind it, but if it's not fiscally possible, then it would be stupid of us to say, oh yeah, let's spend $30,000 a year to have paid parking. So I think the idea behind everything we're doing, this whole project, is fiscal sustainability moving into the future.
Yeah.
So I think the very first thing is, you know, could we do it? Could we generate enough revenue at, you know, 50% vacancy at peak times to, you know, have the support staff and the infrastructure in place to even consider it? If we can, then we can have the conversation. If we can't, then it's not worth having a conversation because nobody wants to, you know, spend $10,000 to make $5,000. You know, just make sense. And the other thing I would say is that this, in future developments, where we take, you know, you go, you know, 5 miles east of downtown or west of downtown, and you're dropping in a brand new community on 100 acres, it may make sense for the developer to say, okay, look, in this core business area, we're not going to put as much parking, and we're going to use paid parking there. And I think that would be a conversation, where this conversation could center around that, because in that case, they could save money on infrastructure costs and make paid parking a thing, or maybe the residents in that area get to park there for free. And if I'm driving from down here to over there, maybe then I pay or something like that. But paid parking in our existing areas, I don't think it would be fiscally sustainable.
Sure.
And even if it was, I don't think we have the support of the community to do that. We're already spending tax dollars to the BEDC to try and bring people to downtown. And if we start, the easiest thing to say is, you know what? I don't want to go downtown, so I will go to a chain restaurant or a big box, store over here where we have, 75% parking vacancy and it costs me nothing. I'd rather go over there and eat, somewhere over there than to coming into downtown. So it makes no sense to,
I think what you're hearing from this group is that we need more statistics before we enter into some in-depth conversations.
Okay.
Matt, I would also like to know an approximation of initial cost to install parking meters or whatever method would be used. That would certainly play into it in my mind.
All right.
Matt, were we talking about paying for the entire downtown or on-street parking? Like, the city lots would be free, on-street parking would be metered, or?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, you'd have to take a look at it, and it might just be from, Chestnut to a certain spot right in front of the, businesses on Main Street might be paid, and the lots are free, or, whatever that might be. I can tell you we hear often from some of the people who have restaurants and others on Main Street it is a problem. Whether people are parking there all day or different employees will park in front of one business and walk to the other, and their different businesses' employees are parked in front of one business one day, and it's kind of it's a challenge. So this was one idea that could help remedy that, but would also be beneficial to the city. So we're not suggesting that the entire downtown be paid. We're not suggesting that the lots be paid. We're just wanting to have a conversation on, is that something worthwhile looking into?
I would say that, I can certainly see value in clearing out Main Street, every 2 hours or something like that, because I think there are a fair amount of people that will drive down, park. It's not a big issue for them. 2 hours is plenty of time to eat a meal and hang out and move on with your day, or even do a little light shopping. Our downtown isn't massive. People are walking. I park in the lots quite frequently, and they're very convenient. I'd have an issue with parking there, but if you can't park there, you park on the street, which I think creates another problem. Especially if they're only 50% full, we don't have much incentive to enforce those laws.
Yeah, you hardly ever see on-street parking unless it's peak times or during events.
I feel like obviously financial sustainability is, I think key to it. We need to make money off this process. But yeah, I actually see a lot of value in on-street metered parking, not necessarily in lots, but I think as a policy going forward, I think Bastrop, if we need to code anything, or if it just can be adopted as a resolution of council later on, I think that it may not make sense right now to meter the streets, but I can absolutely see, tell you what, you park your car in front of someone's house on a street, and they're gonna come out and yell at you the second day it's there, because we feel we own that piece of street. And you own a restaurant and there's 2 or 3 spots out in front of your restaurant that someone's occupying all day long, you're going to directly see that as an assault to you and the way your business works. And I think there needs to be some protection for, some people may not have a problem if they park in front of their business all day long, but I think most businesses would. And so,
So an alternative maybe to not paid parking then would be to have a restriction like we've had in the past, a 2-hour limit, whatever, and then you have to either move it or get a ticket, and we've had that in the past. It kind of fell by the wayside, and then it just disappeared, so.
Right.
How was that monitored?
It wasn't.
That was my question
It wasn't.
I don't know what a full-time code enforcement officer currently takes or even a part-time, I don't know what the cost of that is, but I don't want our police resources being used to enforce a 2-hour parking limit. You're blocking my driveway? Sure, call, let's tow, but to have, to have our limited resources, doing,
I just want to let you know that the Supreme Court passed case law not too long ago that it's an illegal search and seizure for code enforcement or a police officer or a traffic control officer to chalk a tire. So without being able to chalk the tire, not having parking meters, we're going to have to figure out a different way if you want to just have a 2-hour no parking ordinance and not charge parking, but to try to enforce that will be much more problematic than it used to be in the old days when you just had somebody drive by, mark the tires, come back 2 hours later and the mark hadn't moved, issue the citation. So
Chief,
that
could I
might
put you on the spot and ask you what you, off the top of your head, what a full-time code enforcement officer costs the city with hourly benefits and all that kind of stuff?
probably about $40,000, somewhere around there. But I will tell you that whether it's a code enforcement officer or it's a police officer, with the equipment that we have, it takes about 30 seconds to write a parking ticket.
I guess for me, it's not just writing the ticket, but it's the tracking, and it's how do we know it's been there for 2 hours if we don't have meters and stuff?
Well,
like
and
that?
that's the problem. If you don't have meters, whether we have 5 code enforcement officers or not, it's something that we'll have to go. But if you went to a meter and the meter expired, if you're worried about police officers or how many people we would need to enforce that, it's not as problematic as you think, because the devices that we have now, we scan your registration, we punch it in, we put in the and ticket prints, and it's quick.
Okay.
I've been here since only late 2004, and we've been discussing parking. We've been discussing how do you tell if somebody's been there 2 hours or not. Do we do paid parking? It's a buzzsaw. It's not going to be an easy discussion. And until or unless you can make the case too that it's going to be a revenue enhancement, it's going to be a discussion that's going to be filled with lots of passion on both sides.
Sure.
The 50% vacancy that
When
you're
is
talking
that?
about.
When is that?
So we talked about number one, peak times, but what areas does that cover? Is that just the 2 lots? Is that the lots and Main Street?
That's Main Street, that's lots and on-street parking, like on the subsidiary streets around Main Street.
So to me, at this point, with that type of statistic, we are a solution looking for a problem by talking about changing parking in any way, shape, or form, because at any given time during peak times, if you can't get out of your car, and I'm not talking about like handicap spots, but if you can't get out of your car and walk half a block to purchase something or go have a meal, or park in a lot and walk 300 feet, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, to try and legislate, convenience for everybody. If that business owner's upset because people park in front of their businesses, I get the feeling, but it's a public street, and if we don't have a problem, and if there's plenty of parking behind, again, the discussion at this point seems with a 50%.
Well, the discussion
vacancy
amongst some of the vendors downtown is a problem for them.
What is the problem?
The problem is that the on-street parking in front of their businesses, although they don't own them, people are parking those, and there's no incentive for them to leave. So if I work 3 doors down on Main Street, I'll go park 3 doors down in front of another restaurant, and then I'll walk over and spend my entire shift camped out right in front of your parking spot. And that's just what they're saying, that it's a problem.
And I can appreciate that.
Right.
But the reality is that everything we're talking about in the P4, P5 corridor is to get people out of their cars, not designed to pull up in front of your,
Sure.
The idea of parking on Main Street or parking in a P5 area is not to get to pull up in front of, Maxine's, get out, walk in, 4 or 5 feet and walk in.
And we're not arguing
So-
that there's a shortage of parking anywhere. This was just a possible solution to the problem that some people downtown feel that there is, that there's no
But the
churn at the curb.
So what
The
if
statistics
we,
say, though, that there's not a problem. The numbers say there is not a problem
The statistics say that we have plenty of parking.
in downtown for access to downtown businesses.
That's correct. The problem is the churn at the curb. So similar to a restaurant, you make more money the more times that tabletop turns over. It's very similar in a curb front. So you don't want somebody camped out there for 8 hours a day. And the thought is, if you can incentivize somebody to move, so first 30 minutes might be free. I don't know. So if you're just running an errand, you wouldn't penalize like a copy machine person, because you can run in, run out, do your business, and go. So again, it's just a conversation. I'm happy to bring more data. We had a conversation about it before, but I'm happy to come have that same conversation.
I also think there's alternatives. If that is the case, people are parking and then working 8 hours and coming back to their car, you could put signs that say for retail customers only. You could put, it wouldn't work? Is that what you said?
It's difficult to enforce.
I mean, it's difficult to enforce, but you can't put chalk on their tires. It's a prohibitor, if
Yep.
nothing else. If I saw
It's
a
a
sign
deterrent.
that said retail parking only, I would be like, oops, I can't park here.
Yeah.
And move on, me personally. Also, just a suggestion, a lot of businesses have their names, Pawpaw's Parking Only, or something of that nature that you could put. Or you could put a sign that says 2-hour parking. Yes,
You
you
could.
can't, it's no way to police it, but it is a prohibitor. It prohibits people.
It's a deterrent.
Yeah.
I think it'd only be a deterrent though for the first month or two, and then once everybody figured out, like,
I don't
oh
agree.
hell, like
I don't
nobody's
agree.
gonna do anything.
I don't agree. I mean, you see this type of stuff all the time in cities, bigger cities, and the parking spaces are empty. If you go to Chili's and it says to go, I never see anybody camped out in the Chili's to go parking lot.
But that's private property.
That's an example. Because it says to go. So most people aren't gonna pull their car and then go in the Chili's
Yeah.
and have a good time. My thing is, it's an alternative to the paid parking, which is definitely not gonna be accepted in the community. And as everyone stated, the cost factor is not there.
I think we, Matt, bring back some
Yeah,
some data.
absolutely.
Just throw one more thing out. On the flip side, the implementation of paid parking can result in a reduction in the average time that someone stays downtown. Do you know how many people park? They go over here and eat, they walk down the street, they do all kind of things. So that reduction in that, and they have figured the 20% on the leakage is going to hurt actually the revenue and the sales taxes brought in. So I'm just saying there's always another side.
Yeah, and again, we're not saying you pay everywhere. To Commissioner Connell's point, there's parking, and we want you to stay downtown, but if you're going to stay for 8 hours, maybe you could park in a parking lot that's maybe half a block around the corner.
Right, and
And
you know, a
that's,
really
that's
good,
the only conversation.
and then I've just read, and I've been on Main Street, and I've read so many articles about how do you solve this problem with the workers, because we've had it forever.
Sure.
But I think another thing that could happen is communication, maybe with the Downtown Business Association and the Main Street programs, communications with the businesses to encourage that, because I would think most businesses would want to help instead of hurt, because they're hurting themselves if they don't.
Okay.
Matt, is that example that you used of employees of other businesses parking in front of another business all day, is that the primary culprit? Is that the main people that are abusing it?
I can't say that. We haven't camped out front and, kind of where people go. I'm saying from different input meetings that we've got, and just historically speaking, that's a complaint that we hear from downtown shop owners.
And historically, when the Downtown Business Alliance was active in putting on events, we did have conversations with a lot of the business owners downtown, and they'll say, so-and-so's employee parks in front of my business and walks down the street to where they work, or this business owner will park down here and walk to their business.
So if we were
So
to
it's
put
been an
the-
ongoing problem.
Yeah.
And it's not gonna have an easy fix.
So if we were to
We're
put
not
the
gonna solve it
retail
tonight.
signs up, retail only, and I
Sure.
own Pawpaw, and I know for a fact that this person works downtown and they continue to park and the sign says retail only, then my recourse would be to contact who?
Can you speak to how we would
It's
enforce that?
It's
It's a
a
public street.
public parking spot, so no one business could ask you to remove.
Exactly.
If I want to park there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never, well, outside of being a junk vehicle, or sitting there, but but that's the difference between like Chili's or owning the parking lot. Everything on Main Street is public parking. The solution might be to get rid of all the parking on Main Street and widen the sidewalks.
That's a solution.
I'm gonna throw that one out there. Get rid of all the parking on Main Street, widen the sidewalks, and we're already.
That's a conversation for another night.
As
That's
a
actually
business
not a
owner,
bad idea.
as a business owner, to a certain degree, couldn't you
He's being facetious.
Right, that's my
tell the employees, park here? I mean, I've worked at places where they said, you can only park here, and if you park somewhere else, you'd get called out on it. Hey, you need to move your truck over there.
Sure.
Couldn't you, as a business owner, say, my employees need to park over here?
And
tell
that's
your
kinda where I
employees
was
that
going
that's
with
where they need to park.
I think you could, and I think Chair Moore has stated they've had those conversations, and
And it works
Nobody's-
for a
yeah.
little bit, or if this business does it and this business does it, but these guys out here don't do it, then
Yeah.
it falls apart.
Requires cooperation,
General question,
Yes.
which takes effort.
And
to work.
coordination. Yeah.
just a general question, because it sounds like, and I'm not going to wade into that deeply, but it sounds like it's a nuisance. And we've been talking about trying to, and that's I'm not trying to be funny about it, but aren't we trying to deal with things and identify certain nuisances? And I mean, is this not one of those?
Yeah, but parking on a public street during the day there's no way that's not a nuisance though.
yeah,
It's like if I want to park in front of your house all day, I could, as long as it's a public street, you could do that.
It just seems to me that if we're trying to get people to go downtown and you've got spots occupied for 8 hours a day, people traveling through downtown aren't going to know where our lots are necessarily. We can, by the way, increase signage for where, public parking lots are, but you're driving through Bastrop for the day, you're going to drive downtown, you're going to see a restaurant, you're not going to see any parking, you're going to move on. The whatever fee it is, the cost to pay isn't going to stop someone from going to Papa's and go, but not having a place to park that's convenient for them. So if we can turn the cars over faster on Main Street, have essentially more available space on Main Street, I think that captures the new business. People who know the area, sure, they can find ways around it, but people who know the area don't mind parking and walking because they know what that entails. They know the navigation. It's not really a problem for the residents. Residents can easily plan around it. I see it as new people coming through town. Are they going to stop and eat here, or are they going to move on and go to Jack in the Box, or are they going to go to Chick-fil-A down the road? And if they don't see a parking spot, you can say, hey, we've got 80% vacancy over in that parking lot, but unless there's a guy there to direct them to it and tell them that it's there, and then I just think that you're going to miss some opportunities on Main Street to capture people who would come and enjoy our town, but otherwise won't now because, we've got less parking available.
So I'm going to do a flip on that. I'm sorry, Debbie. I'm going to flip that around and say, I'll go down Main Street and I see maybe there's not parking, but there's a lot. And I'm going to drive around because everybody drives around. But then I see, I want to go down to Papa's and eat. Wait, I have to pay to go to Papa's and eat? No, I'll just go out on the highway where I don't have to pay. So there is.
or you could just park in the parking lot you just circled and walk to Papa's, but that's right.
I think Matt has a lot to bring back to
Absolutely.
for further study.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
expecting that conversation where you at.
Yeah, so all the different types, it can't be one size fits all. The way we've been doing it's really not working. It'll be some combination approach. It needs to complement the district or the place type, and we really want to build to people and neighborhoods, not to the automobile. And again, that whole maximums versus minimums kind of conversation. Any more questions? All right. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we're here. So this meeting, we also putting together a list of your recommendations for City Council. So we'll go through these briefly, we'll go through these and spend as much time as we need to. And then you all have a joint meeting with City Council on the 9th. Where you all will discuss some of these recommendations. When staff was looking at the schedule, we thought it might be wise after all the codes come together at your regular August meeting to give one more crack at this, dust them off, polish up those recommendations. There might be something you hear at an additional either community input with the development community, another council meeting or other where we might want to sharpen these. And then make that one final push before you all take these to public hearing process in September.
Will that be at 6:30, the meeting? Do we know?
On the 9th?
That's a regular council meeting,
No,
isn't
that's
it?
at 4 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so on the 9th, it starts at 4 o'clock. We're actually going to have a regular P&Z meeting at 4 to consider a plat. and then you'll go into a joint session at 4:30. But we all will meet at 4 o'clock.
Will that be that time be difficult for any commission members to make?
4 o'clock on the 9th.
Yeah, I won't be here on the 9th, just make note of that.
Just the time, it's early, so I just
Sure.
wanted to, we'll let our absent commission members know
Yes.
that it's an early meeting. And
We will.
and
We'll
see.
send that out.
Is it a meeting or a workshop?
We're having a meeting at 4 o'clock.
A regular P&Z.
a regular
Special-
P&Z meeting.
A regular special P&Z.
A regular special meeting in advance of the joint work session at
We'll just need to make sure
4:30.
we have a quorum.
That's exactly why
Yeah.
I raised
So
that issue.
the 9th has been on the books for some time at 4:30, but the 4 o'clock is a change. So we'll continue to schedule that and thoughts that we will be able to make quorum ahead of that P&Z joint work session. So let's go through these. Permitted use charts. These are some of the conversations that we had. We spent a lot of time talking about SOBs, sexually oriented businesses and others. And where we kind of landed is you can't not have them anywhere. So we talked about having them as a CUP in the employment centers only, like the more intensive warehousing, industrial type areas. We talked about smoke shops and some storefronts. We talked about how industrial and manufacturing uses are really not appropriate except for those employment centers. So not in your real core, your downtown, or your mix, but only in those areas of employment center. We talked about CUP for alcohol sales for breweries and wineries and things of that nature. And we talked about continuing that. And then we just had a kind of a broad discussion on what employment centers are. We talked about that's kind of your more heavier warehousing, industrial type uses that you don't want everywhere. And that's why we've separated them out from the core district. We will have a conversation about state and federally regulated uses. So some things we can and cannot regulate, and we'll let our town attorney, our city attorney weigh in on those. And then we talked about compatibility versus building setbacks. And where we landed is just having the building setbacks and regulating nuisances. And we just want to make sure that that is indeed the case that you all recommended as a board. Okay, I'm seeing a good nodding of the head. So that's what
I
we
didn't
had.
agree with that, but
I know you didn't, but I think we had a consensus among the group that that was the way to go. And I'd invite you to visit with Matt Lewis at some time. I think he would have some more things to say regarding that. But these are the things that we had, and so these are the things we will build into that kind of list of recommendations to deliver to council where permitted uses are concerned. Did we miss anything?
where are we going to determine density? If I were to try to develop, I want to buy a couple of lots string together, and I can do this, and I wanted to understand how many units I can fit on this. Where would I find that?
Yeah, so Matt Lewis could speak more eloquently, but long story short is we're not. We're not going to put a number to density. What we are going to do is regulate your building types and the different place types and the different character districts. So like he was talking about, you won't see that type of intensity or that density in a P3 place type because those building types are not allowed. So by regulating the types of buildings you can build on a lot, you regulate the density. City council's had some talks on height restrictions and such, which will also put a limit on that. But in terms of just saying, you know, you can only have X amount of units per acre, we're not doing that anymore. We're trying to open it up to a mix of housing types, a mix of housing products to provide housing opportunities for a mix of people. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions on that? All right. Let me make a note. All right. Community values. We discussed daycares. We discussed curfews. We thought that the current regulations or how we're treating that now is appropriate. We didn't recommend any changes to that. Construction hours. We have some conflicting language now. Chief weighed in, and new regulations are going to be 30 minutes prior to and 30 minutes after dawn or dusk. That way it kind of fluctuates during the summer months. whereas it might be dark at 5 o'clock in the winter, it's light at 9 o'clock, and people like to get those extra hours in the day. So instead of having set hours, it'll fluctuate from dusk to dawn. Loitering and camping in public, again, current regulations. You all didn't make any recommendations that would change or do different than we're doing today. That's how we saw it. We're wanting to make sure that's how you all remember it. Excellent. Accessory dwelling units, I would like Matt Lewis to weigh in on this one. We discussed looking at a floor to area ratio, Mr. Cerna, and that might be an appropriate way to do it. The other thing we talked about was a placement on the lot, whether or not you could have it in front of a primary structure, what that looks like. What if the primary structure is smaller than the secondary structure? So I would like Matt Lewis to weigh in on the floor to area ratio versus maybe like just the impervious cover. And so if Matt, do you have anything to say to that?
Sure. And we had a long conversation about this, and because there's no minimum lot dimensions, and we don't know what the market would produce, we felt that floor to area ratios may be arbitrary, because then someone may just buy the tad extra land to hit the FAR requirements, which again, they could do it through impervious cover as well. So there's not necessarily a quantifiable answer to this, other than maybe saying a number per lot. That's a common thing that communities would do, is just say no more than 1 per lot, no more than 2 per lot in this area, rather than doing FARs. Furthermore, because of lot dimensions, and running it as an FAR, you could have a large lot that would generate a really large accessory dwelling unit that may be out of scale with the compatible areas around it. And so there's, we ran through a series of scenarios on how to equate this, and it just gets really complex with the FAR. And so furthermore, it adds complexities to the homeowners if they're just trying to build an accessory unit. Going back to the conversation earlier, when we first proposed this, we were trying to do buildings so light, we introduced something called a handshake building. It's like where your neighbors allow you, like, I'm cool if you build that building. It's not, it's, you're cool, that we got thrown out very quickly. But just to show you the intent language behind what we're trying to push. But the thought is that if you just regulate by number of unit per lot, it may not have negative impacts that potentially creating some arbitrary regulations of FAR or impervious cover that could have. And so that was just a recommendation. But again, it's worth the dialogue, and maybe it's worth trying and then modifying. I mean, again, this may not be perfect.
That's what I was getting to about the density. If you're going back and telling so many units per acre or so many units per lot, that's really direct. So I understand that, and I understand both ways. I think it can go either way. Yes, but impervious cover is one way to do it as well.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So are you advocating for impervious cover with unit restriction, or just unit restriction?
We would recommend one or the other, or with maybe a max unit, maybe with a max cap of saying 2. Because what if you did get someone that bought a large lot and put a primary structure, and then they say, well, my impervious cover, I can build 7 of these because I bought a huge lot, and then you have 7 accessory dwelling units behind a front structure.
And that was my example, I think, with the old Spring Street office, is that it's real big back there. So if I could build you essentially end up with a multifamily, structure that's just separated out, which is not what anybody wants to look at or be around. So it would make sense to limit the units, but then to have some type of size limit on that as well, because if I can build, if I can build as big as I want, there's no impervious cover limit, then you run into other problems
as
well.
Yeah, and so it may be a blended approach. It could be a great solution.
I think that's why the impervious cover works well. And also keep in mind, you still have to get setbacks. You still have to, once you hit either 2 or 3 on a lot, you have to put in fire lanes. So we're not talking about something that's going to be your everyday occurrence. Once somebody is told they're going to have to put in a fire lane for a fire apparatus, the cost analysis of making that happen diminishes pretty quickly. Could it happen? Sure. But again, if it's not a life safety issue and it's not a nuisance, is it a real problem?
Well, but the number of units could be a nuisance.
In what way?
Because I don't want to look next door to the, if we're talking about having blocks with irregular lot sizes and stuff like that, I don't want to have to look at my backyard and see 4 or 5 little huts just because my neighbor happens to have a larger lot. It kind of goes against what, it goes against, I think, what downtown is now. I mean, I can't think of a lot of a lot of properties, unless y'all have better examples where we have.
Yeah, there's one
multiple-
directly behind us that has about 5 or 6 of
well,
them
right, so
right
it's-
there.
And that to me is more like a multifamily structure. I mean, and they're so close together. So,
Sure.
you know, what do we have for impervious cover now? Or what's the recommendation, or what was the original recommendation for impervious cover for
Do we have that in the code?
like for the P3?
I believe it's 55% is what it's written in the code.
So like 55% and 2 ADUs, you know, would make sense. I can't see why you need
There you go.
more than 2 unless it was, you know, there was some type of commercial aspect to it, or
So to that point, if you trigger the fire the fire lane and things like that, would you be willing to make that a conditional use permit and say it might be appropriate, but you need to have a conversation?
so like two by right and more than 2 would be
Sure.
a CUP.
Sure.
I think that, in my opinion, that would be appropriate because it gives the neighbors the chance to come in and say, hey, we don't care, or come in and say, whoa, 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 you know, we got an issue.
Is the detached garage an ADU?
No, no, ADU would be like a you can
A
live-
dwelling.
Yeah, dwelling. So now if you put a garage with an apartment on top of it, that would apply. So unless y'all can think of a good reason somebody would need more than 2 by right, I can't.
I do like the idea Patrick's talking about, 2 by right, more by CUP. How does this, I mean, I know that impervious coverage would relate, but, you know, just like accessory structures on the property, workshop, something like that, not
Yeah.
necessarily intended for living, but just governed by
Impervious cover,
coverage.
that's
but
correct.
that up to that point, it could be as large as
Yes.
one wanted.
Yes. You're not writing anything into the code that would say
It just
can only
seems a
be-
little,
Yeah.
out there, like you're saying, do more than 2, and it's looking like a multifamily situation. And I know, what would trigger a fire lane? How many units would you have to exceed?
I think it's once you hit over 2. It's either 2 or 3, and I apologize that I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but we'll have that the next time we speak, and I can also email that out. But I like the idea of tying it back to the International Fire Code. I think that makes pretty good sense, and once you trigger, those fire improvements that are suggesting that you've now moved from a more residential use into a more commercial use, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So are we advocating lowering the threshold for the fire code to 2 units?
I don't know if it's 2 or 3, and I'll have to get back to you on that. It's 2? Okay, it's 2. So you're recommending in line with the fire
Any
code.
more than 2 ADUs on a lot would trigger the fire code
Fire
issues
access,
to
that's
pop up.
right.
Okay, so we don't really need to limit them then if that's already limited.
No, you could
We
do.
limit it to 1.
No, you could do more than 2, but you're going to have to put in a fire access. So the fire code doesn't say you can only do 2. They're saying once you hit that 3rd, you have to provide fire access on site.
Okay. So I think we're still at 2 with 55% of previous cover by right. Anything else requires a CUP.
So what I'd like
I'm throwing it out there.
to suggest is that you follow the impervious cover of the place type. So it might be 55%
I'm
in
sorry, of the place type. My
Yeah.
apologies. Of the place type.
percentage of impervious. 2, and then anything above 2, come have a conversation with you and council. Is that
It's not even so much that as much as it is public input. Your neighbors get a chance to
notification? Yeah,
Right. So
that's what I mean when I say that, and I don't every time, and thank you for correcting me.
I want to make sure that for those that watch the meeting later,
That's right.
that they understand that the whole purpose
The
of coming
notification
before
of your
PUC
neighbors
and
and
the
right,
council is that they
have
get
that
to come-
opportunity to put input on it, yes. Thank you. All right. Anything else on that, or we all pretty good?
Did we ever have a consensus on whether an ADU in front of a primary structure was something we wanted to?
No.
No consensus, or no, you don't want it?
No, I don't want it. And I don't know that we had a consensus, but no, I don't want it.
I agree.
That's kind of where I'm at.
I think we have a consensus.
If
no.
your ADU is larger than the primary structure, you're creating a new primary structure.
But under that scenario, doesn't the ADU become the primary structure?
That's what I'm getting at. If your home's 1,000 square feet in the back and I put a 3,000 square foot ADU in the front, that 3,000 square ADU is the primary.
Yeah, and as long as it fits setbacks and it doesn't exceed impervious coverage.
But the intended consequence would be your let's just say your 1,500 square foot house, here, and then I have two little, 200 square foot ADUs in the front, and so it's like, two little huts and then your house behind it, in this area down here. That's
Well, I think it deserves some thought, 'cause I agree with what you're saying about putting the little huts in front of it, but for houses that are set deep into a lot, there's advantage to build something closer to the street rather than destroying the primary structure and rebuilding something in front, so you could call it your primary structure, some way in redesignating what is your primary structure.
how could we? I mean, we're trying not to regulate, so
It's really difficult to do. I ran into an issue with it before where it was a deep lot. It was a larger lot. Somebody wanted to build a smaller house for their mother to move into in front of their primary residence, and we didn't allow it. It required this huge variance. Ultimately, it was approved, but in theory, the accessory dwelling unit was in front of the main structure, but it functioned, everything as a single-family residence.
And that's the ideal example. The less ideal example is somebody who buys a rental property and goes, oh, I could put two little things in the front, and then we're stuck with something that's not at all what we.
Are there elements within the placement of the building and the design book that might help regulate this, or do we need to regulate this if it's a concern?
If this is becoming a concern, I would advise you regulate it, and I just wrote some recommendation language. ADUs must be in the third layer unless it's a corner lot, which would be allowed in the second layer because you could have side entry garages with a garage
What
in
do you
it.
mean layer?
So under the building, under the code.
I'm talking about, explain
Yes,
what
ma'am. Under the building Bastrop code, the lots are broken into 3 layers. The first layer is where the buildings relate to the public space and the streets. The second layer is where parking goes. The second layer on a corner lot, though, could be a side entry garage, those types of things, but still, that's where the parking will go. And the third layer is the backyard. And we say what happens in the backyard stays in the backyard. It's like it's out of the public view type of thing. And so if you put a requirement in there that accessory dwelling units would be required to be in the third layer, it would put them in the back section, or at least ensure that they're behind the primary front facade. The primary front facade would always start at the second, where the second and first layer meet.
That's the goal.
And so that's the goal.
So you could do that, yeah.
Want a little
Yes.
more explanation?
Yes, ma'am,
People
that's
that
very
might be
helpful.
watching.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
However, would that take lots that are already existing and apply that? Because if it's a deep lot that's already existing, when we apply the place type to it, if it, it could be in the far back of layer 3, and so we still have all that space at the front, which is still considered the third
Right,
layer.
the third layer.
So
That's
could
correct.
we regulate it by saying if you build an ADU ahead of the front facade, that it has to be at least as big or bigger than the primary? I mean,
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I think it'll be a really rare case, I'm guessing, that's gonna come before us like that, so I don't know how far we need to get into it, but maybe that's the way to deal with it.
that's not a bad idea, is to make it a CUP required.
There you go.
So if it's an ADU in front of the front facade, it's a CUP conversation.
That's great.
The only thing is, is the only way to define an accessory dwelling unit based on the timeline with which it was placed on the lot.
That's
That's the way we define
That's a $1
it.
million question. I mean, what
it's
actually
very
defines it
clear
as an
with time
accessory
rather than,
dwelling?
Which is the dominant structure on the site.
Yeah. I would like to, if we can get to a place where, we actually have a policy on it. I wouldn't like to litter it with CUPs, because I think the intent behind this whole thing is to have less of those. I know we're greatly restricting that, but I think if we can agree that the intent of the accessory dwelling unit is not to have, different types, just different things that we've discussed tonight, I would like to take a crack at some language that might satisfy that intent, that we could move forward and just make it a part of the code, without having, because if a CUP comes along, odds are it's going to be, that we think these are great, but not right there, and then we, deny it and keep on moving down the road. So if it's appropriate with some type of, process and/or restrictions that we can code in, I would much rather do that. It might not be possible, but I'd like us to maybe think about exploring that.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Will you also include a size? I know some, like a tiny house is technically an RV. Excuse me. And are we gonna kind of address, because I think those.
So maybe maybe accessory dwelling units are only allowed to be a certain type of building type. If that can we work on that? Yeah. Okay, we'll work on that. Does that make sense? So it can't be like, we'll work on that. But I think we can probably get there. And if we could, because globally, even last night, looking at the comment cards, people love the idea of these. Now, they don't make sense all the time, and that's why we'll code these restrictions in. But what I don't want to do is regulate them to death and then make them go to this, and then they're great, everybody loves them, just not right there. That's a conversation I want to avoid having.
Make a distinction between maybe even an RV or, someone who's
we'll work
living
on that.
They want to park that and make that their accessory dwelling unit.
Maybe we say that ADUs can't have wheels?
Yeah, until they remove the wheels and put them on a deck or something. Yeah, we'll work on it. We'll work on that. So Florida area CUP. Y'all are creative. I'll give you that much. All right, tree preservation. We talked about this. We went through our current regulations. We all agreed that we thought they were pretty good. We did look at updating some of the things. We looked at updating our tree species. One of the things we discussed was the UT Ladybird Johnson wildflower list. That's all been provided to you. If we decide to go down this road, my suggestion might be to either just adopt that list and link to it, similar to what we're going to do in the state code. That way, as it updates, our list always updates as well. And then we had some discussions on protected trees, how we do that. Is it through homestead? Is it a heritage tree? Is it a 1 acre lot? And then we talked about fines. So we did a little bit of digging in between the couple of days we had and came up with a table here. So you can see it, the heritage tree ranges on species, but it also goes anywhere from 14-inch all the way up to 38-inch. The sweet spot's about a 24-inch tree is what most people take a look at. As always, we're a little bit different from everybody else, and not everybody has the luxury of having the loblolly pines. So staff wants to take a little bit more time and research what the mature trunk width of those are, and maybe most species are this amount, but the loblolly pines is something different because it's really not a species of tree you see over the entire state of Texas, and that being one of the more prominent features in Bastrop, we really might want to think about considering something like that. It may not be necessary, but that's one thing that we're still kind of researching. So as far as having the heritage tree, if we have them and if we protect them, are your thoughts about the 24-inch makes sense? Do you think it needs to be something different?
I think the conversation sat more on what does having a heritage tree mean versus what does it qualify as.
Say that one more time, I missed you.
I think the conversation, I remember Pablo and I talking, the conversation was more about if there's a heritage tree, what does that mean for you? Do you have to, pay to have it removed, that kind of stuff. So I think the definition of a heritage tree, you guys will be able to come up with by making a educated, decision based on the species we have.
So our educated guess is it's going to be a 24-inch tree.
So that I think we care less about what the definition is because you're going to be able to help with that and more or less.
Excellent.
What does it mean that you have that? Like I said last time, I'm not opposed to having a heritage tree protection, but it should apply to city government and county, inside of our city limits. So, I can't cut down a heritage tree, but neither can the city to put a road in or to, do something like that. They're either protected or they're not. It should also be something that if you have a heritage tree, it should also be something that pops up on a title search. So it's something the city needs to make sure we have filed with the county because that would be a due diligence thing that, like, you know, if I bought a large lot with a heritage tree, I would want to know or be pinged that, hey, I can't cut that tree down, you know, because it wouldn't make sense for somebody to do that.
Okay,
So,
I would say that would take quite a bit of work on the city's part to do a
Well, we're gonna-
citywide tree survey.
I mean, if we're gonna say that the heritage trees are important, then the city should invest in a citywide survey to figure out where our heritage trees are at.
Don't you think just a general, the size, except for the loblolly, like you said, we won't go by the 24-inch on that, but,
We just want to make sure.
okay.
Before we
But,
step
but
out.
I don't know if we have to do a study of how many heritage trees there are, because that's pretty intensive. I don't think that's even the point of this.
How would we enforce it if we don't know where at least the largest ones are?
But we have the scrap trees in there already that they can take out.
Yes.
We'll
And-
make them turn in a site plan.
No, but what I'm saying is, we passed this, I cut down my heritage tree, you know, and I dig it up and I take the roots and everything and disappear.
It's code enforcement, same way we catch anything else, observe it. People complain about it.
That's my point.
Yeah,
is-
and
is
so
you
that
have to be
brings
able
us to the next, you know, is the fine. And we talked about in lieu of any fine, there's no incentive not to cut down that tree. So it should be based on a certain dollar amount per caliper inch. We're still going to work through how that works with the
city attorney.
with our court and the city attorney, but we think it's that would be how you go about that.
Can you include a critical root zone, like a development? You can, because a critical root zone means that you can still build close up to it, but you're going to have to do it in a way where you hand dig around the roots, and you can still
Yeah,
people
and
build around these large trees.
Yeah.
They just do it in a very sensitive way, and that's all we're really trying to say is just to think about that big tree on your lot.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
I
so
have-
that would
I
be
have-
observed during construction as well. As part of that, you know, like Matt Lewis was talking about, your drainage and some of those things. During construction, you'd have to show where your protected trees are. And then during the physical construction, you'd have to, you know, fence those areas off so they don't get bumped into or, you know, accidentally removed during the process.
Are we all in agreement that this should apply to everybody? So like the capital improvements as an exception should not be an exception for heritage trees?
I'm saying that we should, I don't think under an acre means pretty much that's all the lots in Bastrop.
What I'm getting
Well,
is
are we going to require the city, do we want to try to require the city or anyone that builds within the city of Bastrop, no matter who they are, irrespective of the person, that they comply?
Yeah,
with
so there's
the
two separate questions. One is, are heritage trees universally protected? It doesn't matter if it's a public utility, a public street, a public anything, or a private homeowner in their backyard. Is a community value, or are we placing our value on that heritage tree, and no matter what, we want those preserved?
Yes.
Yes.
And the only reason I bring that up is
Preserve them,
because
yes.
capital improvement projects were an exception to the
They
entire
absolutely
tree ordinance
Yes, sir.
originally. And so if we're gonna, and I'm not so much concerned, I know this sounds bad, I'm not so much concerned about protecting the trees as much as I am that if the homeowner stuck with it, so is the city. And so is the county and the state and anybody else inside of our city limits, regardless of who you are or what the project is.
Well, I am concerned about the trees.
I'm just- oh.
I'm very concerned about the trees because of the damage it can do all the way around community environments. But I think we all agree it should be fair. Everything should be equal and fair.
Yeah. We'll visit with our attorneys on that, understand the recommendation of it. We'll see how that coincides with like TxDOT, for example. I just don't know. But
If state
we'll-
law supersedes, it's
Yes.
one thing, but it's one thing to say that, it's one thing to tell our citizens, you can't cut down this tree, and then we plow over 4 of them to put in a road.
Understand.
It-
No, like,
it's-
when we have the conversation with council, we'll get our city attorney to weigh in on that.
I would say kind of a similar idea, just, I know that the city has had several improvement projects they've done on technically illegal property that they own. Just hasn't been platted according to the current guidelines. And so, you know, just the cities have the same requirement for platting process that they would develop upon as well, correct?
The cities can be exempt. Go ahead.
Should they be though?
Generally, the cities write a provision in the intro of their codes. It's not in here, we didn't put it in here, that the city is exempt from all regulations of these codes. They write exemptions in themselves to be exempt from the codes for public improvements, those types of things. I think it's great you're having the conversation that the city shouldn't exempt themselves from these, but I do think it would be a really good conversation with the attorney's office to see how that is enforceable. But maybe the intent could be captured within that.
I think it's less about enforcement and more about we either stand by it or we don't.
Oh, right.
I mean,
yeah, I understand, absolutely.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I live in the older part of town, and I've got this huge tree
Mm-hmm.
that was there long before the house was built.
Mhm.
But the tree has gotten huge, the roots are getting bigger. My slab is starting to crack.
Yep. So.
What happens to that heritage tree?
Yeah, so in the current draft that you all worked on with the subdivision, there is a variance process, and you
There is
would
a
come have a conversation with P and Z.
Okay,
And you would have to excuse yourself from that vote.
absolutely. It's not cracking my slab, I don't want to say, but it's getting big.
But there is a variance
There are
process
provisions
for
for
it,
that.
yes, ma'am. So I think I have pretty good direction on the exemption, but we need to have a conversation on who this applies to and who it doesn't. Are we good with the 1 acre? Are we good with homestead? What recommendation would y'all? Currently, it's 1 acre, but there were discussions about homestead, so we just want to be clear in how we purvey y'all's information.
other than the heritage, if it's your homestead, you do what you want.
Okay.
I'm hearing heritage tree, if you have one and you show it, you're making an addition, and it's there, and it's up to the professional to identify, yes, there's one on there.
I'm just saying, heritage tree protected, anything other than heritage, if it's on your homestead,
You're exempt
Yeah, I
from
agree.
tree
I agree with what
preservation.
you're saying, yes.
the Lowe's
Okay.
get a chainsaw and have.
So we're moving away from 1 acre and we'll replace with homestead. Okay,
Are we
excellent.
defining homestead by the county tax roll or by their evidence that they actually live there? Because there are plenty of people who haven't filed their homestead who probably should, but.
Yeah.
live there. So,
Well, we can, if it's not defined in our current ordinance, we'll take a look at that and we'll bring appropriate language unless you feel strongly one way or the other.
I just,
We'll make sure it's
homestead is
defined.
just defined as where you live,
Sure.
but whether or not you file a homestead exemption on your.
Correct.
On your property is.
And the intent would be, it would be the property owner,
Right.
not the residents, but I see where you're going and we'll put some language in there, make sure it's right.
But yeah, just the sensitive to that, just not necessarily the property owner, because that's someone who's not going to live on their land perhaps as well.
Owner occupied, right?
Owner occupied.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. Okay. And fines, we can do some more research on this also, and then we'll also consult with appropriate attorney and everything like that. But do you agree there needs to be some type of remedy when somebody goes outside of our tree preservation ordinance?
I think that if you can do it civilly,
Mm-hmm.
for that civil process, and it's impactful, then yes. But if it's gonna cost me, if the most the city can do is fine me $500 like Class C, and it would cost me, $1,500 to protect the heritage tree, if I really want to, I'm just gonna chop down the heritage tree and pay my $500 fine, because it's less than what it's gonna cost me to go through the city's process. So it would have to be substantial, or at least more costly than going through the process with the city, hiring an expert and stuff like that.
Okay.
That's my thought.
We'll look at it and we'll do it, come up with some appropriate rates and what we can do and what we can't do, and bring that back when we make those formal recommendations. Anything else on trees? This was our list, and did we miss anything? Are we pretty good? Okay. Street sections, we really didn't have much on this. You all were pretty okay with them. We discussed the nuances and how 1 foot can make a difference. What we got from you is that yes, you want to encourage walkability, you want to encourage that multimodal transportation options, and you're definitely open to just sidewalks maybe on one side versus 2 sides when it makes sense. So definitely there's areas where you want them on both sides. There might be circumstances in a rural area or other where you might not necessarily need them because it's just an additional cost, additional upkeep and other. So that's what we pulled away from that conversation. Are we on the right track, or anything we missed? Okay. Signs, this is one that's going to be a little bit more conversation. We talked about neon. We talked about different size limits on monumentation signs. We talked about we don't want pylons. We did get a definitive on that. We know we're going to regulate temporary signs. So, with a grand opening, with a sales event, it's okay for maybe 30 days at a time, 3 or 4 times a year, which is what we do now. So we'll just kind of continue that. And then we talked about, again, height for monuments, and then you all recommended that the ZBA be the commissioner board that those variances go to. That's the only one of them I would like to visit with our attorney on, make sure we're not doing anything funky there.
I think so. What do we recommend on the, because it used to be go to the ZBA, but it got pulled back into this board.
Nope,
Review of
that's not what I had done.
Yeah, so a year ago, zoning board of adjustments used to function as 2 boards, the zoning board of adjustments and the municipal sign review board. About a year and a half ago, we signed an ordinance to abolish the municipal sign review board and remove the sign review back away from the zoning board of adjustments into this body.
No.
So this body.
They still go to the zoning board of adjustments. It just doesn't go, the municipal sign review board is just not a separate board anymore. It just defaults to the zoning board of adjustment.
So the conversation.
But it's a development standard, correct? So zoning board of adjustments deals with, as my understanding, mostly already developed land that, has a concern over something rather than development
It has to do with any
standards.
variable standard of height or size or location that it can be tied back to zoning districts, which the signs are.
So was the discussion then, you all would like to be the board that looks at those variances and not the ZBA?
Well, I guess I'm just confused I say yes to that. I'm just confused, I guess, how the city looks at it now, because I was on the zoning board of adjustments when we voted to abolish that board, and I thought it went through and approved by council
The council approved that to get rid of these municipal sign review board and have the zoning board of adjustment. Because what it was the same people acting as 2 separate boards with
Yes.
different set of criteria and different set of appeal authorities.
It just cleaned up the.
So it just cleaned up the language, and so it just was one board that all of it, and signs have gone to them, but honestly, there haven't been any that have come in a year and a half, so that's
Well,
part
so let me
of
ask the question then, because I guess that was maybe the difference that was there, because the zoning board of adjustments has as a kind of a judicial kind of decision in the end, and the sign review board removed that judicial portion and kind of made it more of a, you can appeal this rather to court, you can appeal this to council. So ZBA is still dealing with signs, but just as far as there's some reason why they can't necessarily build a sign the way you want it, necessarily they can add a different type of sign, I guess. Like if we say no pylon signs and someone wants to add a pylon sign, that goes to ZBA or that comes here?
That you'd have to change the code to do that, because we don't allow it at all. So you can't allow something other than the code already allows with a variance. You can only vary the standards that are already in the code. So if the sign says maximum sign height is 35 feet, you can go to 40 feet for some reason, but you can't say you can have an entirely different sign. It has to tie back to one of the standards that are already in the code.
So specific to this topic, it would make sense to me to pull that from the ZBA and bring it here, only because when we rewrite the sign ordinance, when things pop up, because the ZBA does not make recommendations to council. They're quasi-judicial, that's their job, is to make the decisions. You can't appeal to council, you can't do anything to that. So if we never hear those, then we're not able to make recommendations to the council on changes that could possibly be there, and we're not able to vet those concerns or those variances. So it would make sense that the same commissioner board that makes recommendations to the council about the sign ordinance and how things should change should be the same one to hear those same concerns.
I don't think there's any issue with that. I don't think.
Unless you guys disagree.
I don't think there's any issue with that. We'll make sure of course, the attorney, but that's certainly a recommendation you all can make.
That's my thought. I don't know if y'all.
We agree.
share
I
that or not.
know 2 of you agree. 3, 4. All right. Yeah. Cool. All right. So let's talk. We talked about neon, and so we'll get into that. You kind of asked to look at some examples. So these are some examples. A couple of those are in town. A couple are not. But this is how neon signs are used in different applications. So you have them on building signage, you have them on kind of awning or hanging signs, you have them on a pole sign, and then there's kind of an example of what a monument sign looks like in neon. I will say is in terms of technology now, neon produces less light than like your LEDs, so they're actually less intensive than some of your other sign types now. But again, we have one on Main Street. We have some throughout the town. You wanted to see examples of it. This is what it looks like. So do you think we need to regulate neon as a material?
Before we say that, is neon considered a building material?
So I'm glad you brought that up. Great question. We
Because
talked
if
about.
it is, the conversation is moot.
We
because
talked
can't
about
regulate it.
we talked about 2439 last time, and based off our initial review, the way that they worded that House bill specifically calls out residential buildings and commercial buildings. We would define a sign as more of a structure, and therefore those regulations we do not believe would apply. So we still believe we have the ability to regulate materials as it applies to signs.
So we could still regulate monument signs having stone at the bottom and things of that nature,
Correct.
whereas previously we did not think we could.
That's the stance we're at right now. Again, that just came out, doesn't go into effect till September 1st. We still need a final decision from our city attorney, but having reviewed the bill, that's what we believe the way it reads.
Would it not make more sense to wait then? I mean, we could spend another 30 minutes talking about this, and the attorney could come back and say, well.
Well, the
never
problem
mind.
is the bill doesn't go into effect till September, and so there's just not time to wait.
Is he not still looking into it to make a final determination about
Well,
whether or
he
not?
is. Yeah, he is, but the law doesn't go into effect. So we would want to have a recommendation prior to the law going into effect.
I just don't want us to spend a bunch of time talking about it, and then he comes back and goes, well, you know.
I mean,
we
if
can't.
we think it's a hot topic, we can wait until our city attorney says something. But as it's applied throughout the town and do we
Obviously,
think
does
it's an
anyone
issue?
just have an issue with neon in general? And if the answer is no, then it's a moot point as well. We
I
just
don't-
say
I don't
yes,
think
and if we get superseded by state law, then that just happens.
That's right.
I don't think the neon, but my thought was further down where we're talking about monument signs and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
Whether or not we're regulating
Right.
the certain building materials for
So to go-
other signage.
To
Well,
go
the
back.
A neon sign, I mean, Max seems to me is pushing the limit of the size of a neon sign I'd like to see in the historic area of town.
Would you prefer to see it in a window instead of hanging out as a, what
No.
do you call that, a blade, is
The
it a
blade sign.
Blade
Now,
sign.
now we still have restrictions on the different sign types built into the code, so they would still have to follow that. We're just talking about as it relates to a material.
Okay.
So you're not going to have a 80-foot by 80-foot, hanging sign,
Does-
for example.
Does anybody think that, so correct me if I'm wrong, in the historic district, we could regulate neon to only be in window signs, or, I mean, in the historic district, we could restrict that type of sign that we're
You
looking at.
can, but I think the question is, do you want to? If somebody came in with a refurbished movie theater, for example, and they wanted to put a neon on their marquee sign,
I'm specifically thinking about
so
like-
for example, there's a neon sign on the side of a building that's incorporated into that kind of architecture. If that was, the Palace Theater or the Bastrop Opera, is that a problem? So I'm not
Not in my opinion. I think
When
if
you-
they're
when-
hanging, I
and
think
those
if,
are- go ahead.
I think if they're like where Maxine's is, obviously you don't want something hanging to,
And we have clearance height, we restrict those, and I can get you the exact, it's 8 foot, 8 square feet. Oh, I know, the clearance is 8 feet, but what's the maximum blade size? 4 by 4? So they're saying the maximum you could have on that type of sign is 4 by 4.
I think
So
the
it would-
restrictions there is what I would definitely be concerned about, of course, but like you said, if there was a neon sign for the Opera House, and I was trying to think, the current movie theater we have now, what's the lighting?
Film Alley?
That's
I
not in
don't,
the historic, is that considered historic district?
no, I don't think that's historic district.
Well,
Film
we're
Alley's
not
not
just talking
historic.
about the historic district
That
either,
will-
but
no,
lighting period, as
Yes.
far as the theater, what is that considered?
I don't know specifically,
Okay, I was just wondering if it was considered neon.
I don't
But,
know if it's
yeah.
neon or not.
I mean, it would,
We think it's LED.
okay, it would depend location, of course. And then, like you say, the Opera House, to me, that would be an attraction. To some people, it may be a nuisance. I think it just kind of depends. And
Now, nuisance we would define as light spillover. So you may not like it, but I
Right.
don't think it would be a nuisance.
Right.
It might bother you.
it might irritate me a little bit.
Yeah.
My worst case scenario is our historic district, as it grows and becomes more lively at night, it has, we have the Maxine signs on multiple businesses.
So
and whether
keep in
that's-
mind, if it's in the historical landmarks area, the Historical Landmarks Commission has to review that and give a certificate of appropriateness.
By default already?
Yes,
Never mind then.
anything on an exterior building.
As long as it complies with the size and everything's already
Exactly.
written in, I have no problem with neon.
Can I get a second and a third and a consensus on that, or?
If there is a review process in place, then.
There
that's-
is.
That's fine.
I should have started with that,
I
thank you.
second that.
Okay, so neon, we're good. Okay, so going back, so we talked about different sign limits or size times. We talked about pylons, the height of monuments, and so I wanted to give a couple examples of different monument signs. So these are by definition monument signs. They're very large. They tie into the architectural detail of the development, and these just are what they are. So, is there a reason to restrict height, or do we want to say, as a part of a comprehensive plan package, might be okay? How do we want to deal with that? And again, this slide is more to just show, they have monument signs, they have neon, they have business identifiers. So they're all different types of signs, but they all play off each other. And that would kind of be the idea of having that comprehensive sign package to make sure that they all play nice. But you'll also see no monument signs here above like maybe 6 foot. So there's no group signage, there's nothing like that. And then again, this is kind of what we have today in town.
Is that not a pylon sign?
That is a pylon sign.
Okay.
So we allow those today. To be clear, those are allowed under our code. So we have a lot of them, and almost every business owner has their own. And is that necessary? And so much like parking standards, sometimes things need to be relooked at. Large signs off the interstate was a reaction to automobile traffic prior to having GPS, prior to having your phone tell you where to go, and are they necessary? I don't know if y'all recognize this building in the bottom left. That's a DPS. People find it. A lot of people every day find it, and there's not a single pole sign, monument sign, or building sign. There's a window decal about 10 inches across, and by miracle, several hundred people a day find that building. So
I would also say nobody's driving down the highway going, oh crap, there's Best Buy, I gotta get off, or oh, there's Lowe's, I gotta get off.
no, but TxDOT does provide opportunities to have those signs that say, exit 434,
Right.
go
That
eat
was
here.
gonna be my question. And do we have any of those? We don't have anything like that now, up and down 71.
Yes, ma'am, we
Do
do.
we? I've never paid attention, I guess, because I drive it every day.
Yes,
But
ma'am.
I was wondering that when I was watching it last week. And so I wasn't here on Saturday. So what was the objection to the pylon signs? Which of those pictures, the two tall structures was
Both
considered?
of those are pylon signs.
What
The
was
Lowe's one's a pylon? That's
No,
a
the
monument.
pole is a pylon. I'm sorry. The Lowe's is a group monument sign.
And what was the objection to the pylon?
They're just not aesthetically pleasing.
They're high and they're ugly.
Just if you're going to have one, you can have a better looking one, I think was the direction. And if you can, would you rather have a more aesthetically pleasing one than not?
And what is the Lowe's one considered?
The Lowe's is a monument sign, a group monument sign.
Yeah, I would actually prefer the Lowe's sign.
How
Looking at it.
Do we know how tall the Lowe's sign is, approximately?
Tall, it's 55 feet.
I mean, that's a solid height. Any higher than that, I don't really see the point. I mean,
Okay. So again, like a monument sign, we're good with up to that height. We
In
agree.
general, the height doesn't bother me so much. That one bothers me specifically just because the width of it, just it's a massive structure rather than, signage. You can still follow the architectural cues of the development without, making a guard tower kind of a thing. And
is there a way to write in where we link the sign materials and make them similar to the
monument sign?
materials that are being used for whatever it is? So
Yeah, that's pretty
That's
easy.
actually in the current code for monument signs.
Yeah, any
Okay.
monument sign shall meet the same design, theme and/or
since
materials
we can control
as
that,
the.
we should do that.
Okay.
I think same thing with
Now be careful what you wish for, because if we can't regulate the primary building material, we might be forcing somebody to build a plywood sign, but just saying.
Well, yeah, but
Not that anybody's going to do that, but
the idea being that if you're going to build it, and I would say the same thing would probably go for like entrances to like subdivisions and neighborhoods and stuff.
well,
like
that would still, I think, be a monument sign.
Right.
Yeah.
But the materials would be the same as
Sure.
whatever your common space
They would
is.
complement each other. Yeah.
What we have now really looks good. I went around and looked at all the monument signs on the highway through town, and since we do have those restrictions, let's keep that, because they look good.
And there's no grandfather provision, is there, for pylon signs that fall down?
Currently, we do have that. It's 50%.
60%. So if it more than, if the cost to rebuild the sign is more than 60% of a value of a new sign, then you have to take the whole sign down.
Do you take it down?
Yeah, you have to remove it.
Would
So if
lower
it
that
blows
threshold?
down, if it fully blows down during a storm, the whole thing, then it's
Yeah.
gone, if it's a non-conforming sign, so.
So, I mean, the goal would be to get rid of the 50 million pylon signs we have along the highway, so is there a way to lower that threshold?
I don't think that the state regulates that threshold, so you could make a recommendation of a lower one.
Well, we might have to look that up. There are some regulations at the state level on signs on cities requiring removal, but we'll look and see what that threshold is.
We can look and see if we can make that determination on the damaged sign.
Is there anybody that has a different opinion or on that? Or, I mean, we said no pylon signs because they're ugly, so the idea would be to get rid of them. Same thing with our billboards that are out there. As they fall down, goodbye.
And just make a distinction on those signs that are changing information out in some way so that
Oh, yeah.
those businesses can have some guidance on. how
Yeah,
to
so we wouldn't allow blinking. We would allow scrolling, no flashing, no blinking. And then you can transition from image to image, and then it would still have light standards. So everything that you would think of, we will still regulate. Because if you allow digital, clearly we would. You don't want it flashing, distracting people. So all those will be written in. Do we want to have any more conversation on the percentage of the removal, or are we good with the 60%? And if we can, do you have a recommendation, or would you?
Didn't you say 50% if you demoing a building and you go more than 50%?
Or we're talking about signage. So if the sign is destroyed,
Let's find out how low we can go and then revisit.
Well, I'm wondering if is that not already kind of a number, 50% out there?
50% is for structures. Yeah, where you'll probably get some pushback from sign vendors is you take it too low, at some point just replacing a sign face does away with it. I'm just forewarning you, but we'll take a look at it.
I think that my opinion would be that the city council and our city government is taking a stand on development, that we're going to do what's best for the city, and they're either going to come or they're not. And so I don't see why it would be any different. If we're telling that to developers, I don't see why the sign folks would be any different.
Yep, I'm just telling you. I know we
They're
have
more than welcome to come to our public hearing.
we have some sign companies in town, so we'll take a look on that. So size limits, I heard 50 foot for the height of monuments. Are we? Do you want us? Does that seem appropriate?
It was under a special agreement, our standard right now for sign height is 35 feet is the max, without
Monument
some kind of
signs,
special,
35? Monument signs is 35?
Well, right now monuments I think is around 20, pylon signs are 35.
And I'd like to make a distinction on that, if I could, and if it's appropriate. I think we like this because it's a sign with multiple tenants, and then we like the size of it then. What if it was a single-use tenant? Is it still okay for a 50-foot monument sign? And I'm okay one way or the other, but
As long as it looks pretty and matches the surroundings, I don't think anybody cares. If they want to spend all that money on a single business sign, have at it.
okay.
Did you ever have an instance where the sign would be taller than the allowed building height?
Well, no, I don't think so.
What was it? What did you say?
Well, if your allowed building height is 35 feet,
Because I think that type of sign is only allowed in P5 and employment, which I think they're talking about going up to between 3 and 5 stories. So I don't think you can't have a
I guess I'm
monument sign in
confused.
P4,
You're
right?
asking if what
Yeah.
type of sign can be higher than the building height?
Yeah, I
He's
think-
asking if there would be a circumstance where your sign would exceed the maximum height for your place type. And
it's
so
like-
monument signs are not allowed right now, currently written in P4, which you could in that district, but since monument signs aren't allowed in P4 and only in P5, and they're looking at going to 3 to 5 stories, I don't think you'd
I can
enter
think of
that.
like Eckerd, sometimes they just have a really empty space.
Yeah.
It's like a really
Now,
tall
it might be
park.
taller than the primary structure on the
Exactly.
site, but it won't exceed the maximum height.
So advocating just picking a height then, and the height is what it is?
Which is making
regardless?
clear that it would never exceed the building height. It has to play by those rules too, I would imagine.
We could say 50 feet, but not to exceed the maximum allowable height for the district.
Yeah,
I mean, that would make all the monument signs, like this one then would not be allowed, correct?
It would.
it
No,
would be in scale with the rest of it. That's
Is that
all.
sign not taller than all the buildings that are over there?
I didn't hear that was a concern. What I heard was a concern. What I heard your question to be was, would you have an instant where the 50-foot allowed on a monument side would be taller than the maximum height allowed in the district? So that would not take place, but yes, you might have a sign that's taller than the building. So that Lowe's sign is going to be taller, than the Ulta, or taller than, call it whatever you want to call it. If you made the bank go on that sign's going to be taller than the bank.
So, Paulo, you're advocating that the maximum sign height would be the same maximum height for the building?
No, what you're saying is correct. I'm saying that some people may choose to only build one story, but they can build up to a 35-foot sign. I'm just trying to keep the sign in scale with the rest of the character of the district. Otherwise, you could have an instance
So
where
that's
maybe.
not what I heard your question. So
Okay.
you're saying you want to scale the sign based off the height of the structures.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you had it right the first time when you said
So that's not
that.
what you said the second time.
Okay, then I misspoke. I just don't want to see it. I guess my concern is that you could have a 55-foot high sign, and then
50,
the maximum height of any building or any structure in that district is only 35 feet.
So that is not the case. Monument signs are not allowed in P3, P4, P2, or P1.
They are allowed in P4, as written.
We're not.
Pylon signs aren't allowed in P4.
It's a different type.
Pylon
Yes.
signs aren't allowed anywhere.
Well, yeah.
So the ones that are allowed in P4, there's already a regulation that it's a maximum 4-foot height.
Oh.
So in P4, you can have a monument sign, not this type of monument sign. You cannot have a pylon sign. You could have a 4-foot monument sign. In a P5 district, the way you're proposing it, you could have a 50-foot tall monument sign, but you might also have a 35-foot building on the site. But the P5 district allows up to 5 stories, which would be taller than that. But we can write it if you're more comfortable, not maximum height 50 feet, not to exceed the maximum height allowed for the place type.
Because you had an example of I guess, entrance into a subdivision or some kind of gated community, and it was I'm guessing
Yeah.
that second upper right, maybe, is that?
No, that's a shopping center.
Okay, shopping center.
Yeah.
No, I've seen things like that, though, and
5 stories is 50 feet.
yeah.
No, it's going to be a little bit taller than that. It's 60 to 80 feet you'd have, because you have plate heights and you have roof pitch. And
So the height is tied to,
right now, you're just saying 50 feet.
But you're saying also it could be according to the place type, right? Not to exceed the.
Not to exceed the place type.
Right.
we're only talking about
But we're only
P5,
talking about P5.
Yes, that's right.
What is the maximum height allowed in P5?
They haven't landed there yet. They've been discussing 3 to 5 stories.
So 50 feet is good. Or, I mean, it can only be in P5, and that's either going to be slightly taller or slightly shorter than what's going to be there.
So what is the generally accepted height of a three-story building? What's that range?
So you're going to have the first floor be anywhere between 12, sometime up to 15, and then at least an additional 10 on that. So if you went 12 plus 10 plus 10, that's 32, plus your pitch, plus your mechanical. So I mean, a 35 foot for 3-story maybe, in that range.
So it is, yeah, so it basically just depends on what council wants to put that at.
Yeah,
3
how
to 5
tall is the
stories.
Buc-ee's sign?
It's either 60 or
Sorry,
70
not to put
feet.
you on the spot.
It's
What
either,
is-
it's either 60 or 70 feet. I don't
Yeah,
remember what got
so it's
approved on that
gigantic.
one.
50 foot's a very tall. I mean, I would say
How big was that Whole Foods sign? I think it was Whole Foods that we saw last week, Saturday. It was a sign from, I mean,
is that your PowerPoint?
it was a pretty massive sign.
It was a multi-tenant pylon sign.
It was a nice sign, but it was massive.
50 feet is a really tall monument
So
sign.
this building might be 35 foot tall.
You said 35 is the code now?
Yeah.
Current code? 35 sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
35 sound good? That's what current code is.
Yes, good. Done.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. So neon size. Size limits, we did talk about that for like realtor signs. So it was a 8x4 for commercial, and then 16, no,
4x4, that was.
4x4, 16 for residential. So that was a recommendation, so we got that. We talked about pylons, talked about temporary, restricting them to certain times of year. Just got through height for monuments, clarified that ZBA. Y'all are going to recommend that you all now are the variance, or would see the variances to the sign code. So anything else other than that?
I want to
list?
go back to the height one more time.
'Kay.
So 35 was for a 3-story, you said, right?
Anything in
Okay, so what about?
35 foot is your average 3-story building.
3 stories, so, but we haven't decided on a 5. So what would 5-story be?
35 foot. Oh, tall?
Tall, yeah.
60 to 80.
So I'm not sold on the 35, only based on that. Because I don't want to say, yeah, we only want 35 when the decision hasn't quite been made on the story height and P5.
Yeah.
So I would still say 50.
So you're
And
okay
then
with
we
an
don't-
80-foot sign, or you're
I didn't
just
say
saying
80,
50?
I'm okay with 50. So with 50, we're still, at 5, if we do decide to do the 5-story, we're
Yeah.
still getting the right
50
height.
is
If
a
I have a 5-story
very,
building
very
and a
tall sign.
35-foot sign, that would look a little off to me.
You got a 5-story building, you don't need a sign, Bastrop. I mean,
Yeah, if you have a
plenty of
5-story building,
advertising.
your building is your sign.
You're-
I'd like to
I
go
can
back
appreciate
and-
the concern, but I could care less about the person building a
Right, but in
5-story.
my personal opinion, I would like to have an open for it, to not cut it off
So you do.
at a hard line 30.
You have a variance, and you would have to come and talk to P&Z
Okay.
about it.
So good with 35, and they can appeal it to,
I believe that we have a consensus of 35, and so we'll move that, but it's noted. Okay. Anything else on here that we did not talk about? Okay. The rest of these applications and checklists, we'll fill those in based off tonight. We got different pictures are full. The development intensity, that chart that we need to polish up, but saying, here's what you're doing, point you to this part in the process, so we'll certainly add that. I heard the interactive website and things of that nature, being the interactive dynamic, ease of use, simplicity, no redundancy, facilitate. I really like that. That's actually in our mission statement now. And I appreciate what you said about the codes, Chair, because truly, when you have such conflicting language, it makes it very difficult. So I appreciate you saying that, but we're looking forward to the days where we don't have that anymore. And then the links in the application that directs you to that, I thought that was an excellent idea. And then we're working on becoming an electronic submission. It's not as easy as you might think, especially for plan review and stuff like that. It's very difficult to review plan on a monitor yay big. So there is an expense to the city on upgrading, monitors and stuff like that. I can tell you that's in our work plan to
It's
do.
gold.
Yes, ma'am, it's
It's a goal.
absolutely a goal,
That's all that we
and I
have.
love it. Let me see. So that's what I got on applications. Is that appropriate for tonight's discussion? Okay. Development flow chart, I actually just went through, I believe. Nope. Yes, I did. I didn't have anything else to add from that list unless I was missing something. Okay. And we'll continue to fine tune it again. Parking regulations, I didn't hear anything on that. So, just kidding, man. I'm kidding.
I was going to ask you where you have been for the last 2 years.
So we talked about impervious. We had a lot of discussion on paid parking, the effects of it, the fiscal probability of that happening, how it might affect others, and all of that. So we'll bring back that information and go from there. So that's something we'll continue to talk about. I didn't hear anything as far as in the first 4 place types. I think you all kind of agreed we're headed in the right direction on that. It was really kind of the P5, the core district that I thought that had the most discussion points left. Is that fair? Do we need to go fine tune some of the others? All right now, okay. And again, this is the last time you'll see this stuff. So here's our schedule. We've gone through all the codes now to date. Again, you have that workshop with council. That starts at 4:30, but we do have a meeting at 4 o'clock on Tuesday, July 9th.
Just to clarify, it's a workshop, right? 'Cause we don't need a quorum to do a workshop, so I just want to make sure if we don't have.
No. It is a work session. So it is a joint meeting with city council. But you are going to have a regular meeting at 4, and then you're going to have a regular special meeting jointly with council. So yes, you do need a quorum.
For the 4 o'clock, but if for some reason we don't have one, we don't need one for the 4:30.
You do need one. You
We do
cannot
need one.
have a joint
Okay,
meeting
good.
without a quorum of you
Okay, so it's
there.
not a
Yeah.
work- okay.
Yeah. So, yes, it's a workshop, but it is, you have to have a quorum to call yourselves into meeting, and it's expected that happens. And then again, huh? Yeah, be here at 4. I'll be here. It'll be fun. Final recommendations. We will do some more working on this. We still have some conversations to be had. And so ahead of the public hearing process, after we've had a community developer input, after we have some more information on the design manual, we'll come back, we'll dust these off, and then prepare a final list at your August 29th meeting ahead of the public hearing. And that is all I have for you this evening.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Second.